The morning in Tampa, Florida, was picture perfect that day. The sun had just peaked over the horizon, casting soft golden rays across Tampa Bay, painting a shimmering hue on the still water. The Channelside area, a bustling corner of the city, was slowly waking up. The gentle sound of waves lapping against the Hillsborough River blended with the noise of vehicles starting to roll along Harbor Island Drive, just a few blocks away. The air carried a hint of sea salt mixed with the aroma of coffee from the little cafes lining the street. This was Tampa, on an ordinary day, vibrant, warm, and full of life. Amid the bustling crowd starting their day, Colonel Marcus Hawk Reynolds walked with commanding presence. At 42, Marcus carried himself like a seasoned soldier, broad-shouldered, straight-backed, each step radiating a quiet confidence that didn't need to shout. The dark gray suit he wore was tailored perfection, and his polished leather shoes gleamed in the early sunlight. On his wrist, he wore an old military watch, a gift from his father, a Vietnam War veteran, serving as a reminder of his roots and responsibilities. Marcus wasn't one for showiness, yet his presence always turned heads. Perhaps it was his sharp, deep-set eyes, as if he had witnessed both heaven and hell during his years in Iraq and Afghanistan. Today is a rare day for Marcus to take a break. After weeks of working at the Pentagon in Washington, D.C., he's back in Tampa to visit family and check on the progress of a training project at MacDill Air Force Base, about 4 miles from downtown. He just left his favorite eatery, the Sail Pavilion, where he usually orders a plate of scrambled eggs with bacon and a strong black coffee. The staff there knows him well, always greeting him with a friendly smile. "Hey, Colonel Hawk, how's it going today?" Marcus just smiles back, responding with a polite nod. He enjoys the simplicity here, where no one cares who he is beyond being a good-natured regular. As Marcus stepped out of the cafe, he took a deep breath, letting the cool morning air fill his lungs. He checked his phone and saw a message from his mother, Evelyn, pop up on the screen. "Don't forget dinner home tonight. Son, I'm making your favorite ribs." Marcus smiled, his fingers quickly tapping on the keyboard. "I won't forget, Mom. See you tonight." Family was his biggest support, the reason he always kept himself grounded despite facing countless dangers in the military. He tucked his phone into his suit pocket, his gaze shifting to the black SUV parked about 50 feet away, near the corner of Channelside Drive and Franklin Street. But then, amidst that peaceful atmosphere, a sense of unease washed over him. Marcus heard heavy footsteps behind him, not the casual rhythm of a passerby, but a cautious, deliberate approach. He turned his head slightly, just enough to see 2 police officers in dark blue uniforms moving closer. One was tall with sandy blonde hair, wearing sunglasses, and his name tag read Patrick Sullivan. The other was shorter, with messy brown hair, his hand resting near his gun, Daniel Hayes. Both had hardened, almost hostile expressions locked onto him. Marcus was no stranger to this scene. As an African-American man, he had learned to face suspicious looks from a young age, even now as a colonel in the United States Army. "Hello, sir," Sullivan spoke up first, his voice icy and devoid of any friendliness. "We need to see your identification." Marcus stopped and turned to face them. He kept his voice calm and steady, a skill he had honed over decades in the military. "Hello, gentlemen. May I ask the reason for this?" Sullivan smirked, a smile devoid of any goodwill. "It's just a formality. Hand over paperwork." Hayes stood behind him, his hand still close to his gun, his gaze scrutinizing as if Marcus were a potential threat. Marcus frowned slightly, but he didn't let his emotions show. He knew the law, and he knew his rights. "I haven't done anything wrong," he said, his voice steady. "I was just walking back to my car after having breakfast. Unless there's a specific reason, I don't think I need to show my ID." Sullivan's eyes darkened, and the smile vanished. "Listen, don't make this complicated. Hand over paperwork, or we'll have to handle this another way." Marcus's heart raced, but his face remained unchanged. He had faced more dangerous situations than this during sleepless nights in Baghdad, ambushes in Kabul, so Sullivan's threatening gaze didn't faze him. But he could feel the tension rising, like a smoldering fire about to erupt. "I don't want to cause any trouble," Marcus replied, slowly raising his hands to show he wasn't resisting. "But I have the right to ask why you stopped me." Hayes stepped forward, his voice tense. "We received a report about a suspicious person in the area. You matched the description. Is that enough?" Marcus raised an eyebrow. "Suspicious? I'm in a suit, walking to my car. Are you sure about that?" Sullivan lost his patience. "That's enough. Hand over the paperwork now, or we will put you in handcuffs." The atmosphere suddenly grew heavy. Marcus glanced around as a few passers-by started to take notice, an older man nearby murmuring something to his wife. He knew he had to decide quickly: comply to avoid trouble, or stand his ground and face the consequences. He took a deep breath, his voice calm yet resolute. "All right, I'll hand over the paperwork. But I want to note that I don't agree with how you're handling this." He slowly reached into his suit pocket, pulling out his wallet, his eyes never leaving Sullivan. But just as he pulled out the military ID, Sullivan unexpectedly snatched it away, his movement more aggressive than necessary. "Let me see," Sullivan muttered, glancing at the badge. Then he looked up, his expression filled with suspicion. "Marcus Reynolds? What are you doing here?" "I'm living in Tampa," Marcus replied briefly. "I'm on my way back to the car." Hayes scoffed. "Living here and dressing like that? Seems a bit out of place." Before Marcus could respond, Sullivan stuffed the card into his pocket and signaled to Hayes. "Check him more thoroughly. There's something off about him." And then, like an unexpected storm crashing in, everything started to spiral out of control. The morning breeze in Tampa suddenly turned colder as Colonel Marcus Hawk Reynolds stood there, his military ID snatched away roughly by Patrick Sullivan. He felt his heart rate quicken, but his face remained calm as skill he had learned from days spent teetering on the edge of life and death on the battlefield. The once peaceful channel side now felt suffocated by a tense atmosphere. The distant sounds of traffic seemed to fade away, giving way to the palpable tension between the three people on the sidewalk. Sullivan held the card, flipping it back and forth as if searching for a crack to exploit. "Marcus Reynolds," he muttered, his voice dripping with suspicion. "Military, huh? U.S. Army?" He looked up, his eyes narrowing. "I don't care who you are. Here, you follow our orders." Marcus tilted his head slightly, his voice still deep and steady. "I've handed over the paperwork, as you requested. I'm on my way back to my car, less than 50 feet away. If there's nothing else, I'd like to get on with my day." Daniel Hayes, who was still standing behind with his hand close to the gun holster, let out a dry, raspy laugh that sounded like the wind blowing through the desert sand. "Continuing your day, huh? Listen, buddy, we're not done yet. You fit the description of a suspicious character around here. You might be hiding something." "Suspicious?" Marcus repeated, his voice now tinged with a hint of irritation, even though he tried to hold it back. "I'm wearing a suit, and I don't have anything with me except my phone and wallet. Do you have any evidence?" Sullivan smirked, a cold smile returning. "Evidence? We don't need evidence to check someone like you. Step over there. Hands up." He pointed toward the brick wall of a nearby shop, his tone commanding without a hint of hesitation. Marcus took a deep breath, his gaze sweeping over the two officers. He knew the situation was heading down a familiar path, a script he had witnessed far too many times, not just with himself, but with other brothers and sisters of color throughout his life. His father used to say, "Stay calm, Hawk. Don't give them a reason to make things worse." That advice echoed in his mind like a command from the past. "All right," Marcus said, his voice steady as he slowly raised his hands to shoulder level. "But I want you to note that I'm fully cooperating." He walked slowly toward the wall, each step measuring his dwindling patience. But Sullivan was not satisfied with that compliance. He stepped forward, quick as a hunting leopard, and suddenly grabbed Marcus's right arm, twisting it sharply behind his back. Pain radiated from his shoulder down to his arm, but Marcus gritted his teeth, refusing to let a sound escape. "Hey, I'm following orders," he said, his voice still steady even though the pain made his breathing heavier. "Shut your mouth." Sullivan roared, shoving Marcus's face against the brick wall. The cold, rough surface scraped against his cheek, but what bothered him more was the sheer injustice in every action of this officer. Hayes rushed in, pulling handcuffs from his belt, the clinking metal ringing out like a sentence being pronounced. "You're under arrest for resisting." Hayes said triumphantly as he fastened the cuffs tightly around Marcus's wrists. The cold metal bit into his skin, constricting so tightly that he could feel his pulse pounding beneath the surface. "Resist," Marcus repeated, his voice now tinged with a hint of anger, though he still held it in check. "I'm not resisting at all. I've done everything you asked of me." "We say he resisted," Sullivan replied, his voice as cold as ice, his hand still gripping Marcus's shoulder tightly. He turned to Hayes, signaling with his eyes. "Get him back to the car. Let's wrap this up quickly." At that moment, the incident had caught the attention of those nearby. An older man, Henry Brooks, a Vietnam War veteran living close by, stood about 20 feet away, his eyes wide with shock. He mumbled to his wife standing next to him. "What are they doing to that guy? He hasn't done anything wrong." His wife, her hands trembling, pulled out her phone and whispered, "I have to record this. This isn't right." A young couple walking their dog near the corner also stops. The man, around 25 years old, pulls out his iPhone and starts recording. "What the hell is going on?" he says to his girlfriend, his voice filled with anger. "They're taking him away for no reason." His girlfriend nods, her worried eyes following Marcus as he's being dragged away. Marcus felt the crowd's gaze, the whisper starting to ripple like waves across Tampa Bay. He turned his head just enough to see the phone recording this moment. A glimmer of hope sparked within him that this video could be proof, a voice for the truth. But just then, Sullivan shoved him toward a patrol car parked 30 feet away, the back door wide open like a trap waiting to spring. "Come on, don't waste our time," Hayes snapped, pressing Marcus's head down to force him into the back seat. The car door slammed shut, the sound echoing like a hammer striking at his freedom. Inside the car, the smell of old plastic and sweat hit him, but Marcus didn't care. He sat up straight, his gaze fixed outside through the foggy glass, where the crowd was growing larger. Henry Brooks stepped closer, his voice trembling with anger. "What are you doing? He's a good man, I know him." But Sullivan ignored him, turning his back and signaling for Hayes to get in the car. The patrol car roared to life, the engine's growl shattering the peaceful morning in Tampa. Marcus was cramped in the tight space in the back, his hands cuffed tightly, but his mind remained sharp. He knew this wasn't the end. It was just the beginning of a much bigger battle. As the vehicle rolled away, leaving the stunned crowd behind, Marcus whispered to himself, his voice soft yet resolute. "You just made a big mistake." The patrol car carrying Colonel Marcus Hawk, Reynolds sped through the bustling streets of Tampa, the sharp wail of the siren cutting through the air each time they raced past an intersection. Inside, the cramped back seat made Marcus feel claustrophobic. But he refused to let that shake his resolve. His hands were still tightly cuffed, the cold metal biting into his wrists every time the car jolted over a pothole. Through the foggy glass, he caught glimpses of buildings flashing by, familiar shops in Channelside, and the Tampa Bay Lightning billboard flickering in the distance, but his mind was elsewhere. He was analyzing, calculating, just like he had done during military campaigns in the Middle East. Patrick Sullivan sat in the driver's seat, his eyes occasionally glancing at the rearview mirror to check on Marcus. Daniel Hayes, in the passenger seat, fiddled with the radio, flipping through a few news channels before turning it off completely. "He's way too quiet," Hayes muttered, his tone a mix of curiosity and annoyance. "Not like those guys who love to argue." Sullivan shrugged, his voice flat. "Whatever. Just take him to the station. Wrap it up quick." But Marcus heard it all, and he knew his silence was making them uneasy. It was a tactic he learned in the military. Stay calm. Let the other side reveal their weaknesses. It only took 10 minutes for the car to reach the Tampa police station, a dreary gray building on North Morgan Street, about a mile from downtown. When the car stopped, Sullivan opened the back door and yanked Marcus out with unnecessary force. "Come on, Colonel," he said, his voice dripping with mockery as he read the military ID still clutched in his hand. Marcus didn't respond. Standing tall, his shoulders tense despite the lingering pain from the handcuffs. Hayes followed closely behind, his hand hovering near his gun like he was a ticking time bomb ready to explode. Inside the police station, the atmosphere was more suffocating than Marcus had imagined. The phone rang incessantly, The sound of keyboards clacking echoed from the desks, and the smell of burnt coffee wafted up from the corner of the room. The harsh light from the cold white fluorescent bulb shone down, highlighting the tiny cracks in the brick walls. Marcus was led to the main hallway, where a few other officers glanced up at him. One frowned and whispered to a colleague, "Another case, huh?" But no one spoke loudly, as if they were all too familiar with this scene. Sullivan pushed Marcus toward the registration desk, where a young officer was sitting. His nameplate read Brian Carter, his face tired but his gaze sharp. Carter looked up, glanced at Marcus, then turned to Sullivan. "Name?" he asked, his hand already on the keyboard. "Marcus Reynolds," Sullivan replied, tossing the ID card onto the table. "Arrested for resisting during a stop." Marcus raised an eyebrow, his voice finally resonating deep and clear. "I didn't resist. I handed over the paperwork and followed all their demands." Carter stopped typing and looked up at Marcus again. There was something in his gaze that shifted from suspicion to curiosity. He picked up the card and read it more closely. "U.S. Army? Colonel," Carter murmured, his voice low enough for only Marcus to hear. He turned to Sullivan. "Are you sure about this? He doesn't look like the kind of person we usually see around here." Sullivan shrugged, his tone brusque. "Definitely. He fits the description of a suspect. Don't ask too many questions, just get to work." Carter didn't respond, but his fingers lingered on the keyboard for a second longer than usual. Marcus noticed a hesitation, a tiny crack in the armor of the system. He stayed silent, allowing Carter to think for himself. This young officer seemed different, not like Sullivan's aggressive attitude or Hayes' indifference. After entering the information, Carter signaled for Sullivan to take Marcus over to the fingerprinting area about 15 feet from the registration desk. The old fingerprint scanner whirred to life, a flickering blue light dancing on the screen. Sullivan stood close by, watching Marcus's every move as if he might suddenly spring to life. But Marcus simply complied, placing each finger on the machine, his gaze never leaving Carter, who was still watching him with a puzzled expression. Once the fingerprints were taken, Sullivan and Hayes led Marcus to a small cell at the end of the hallway. The room was only about 8 feet by 10 feet, with a metal bench along the wall and a stainless steel toilet in the corner. The overpowering smell of disinfectant mixed with something musty and unpleasant. Hayes uncuffed Marcus, but didn't forget to give him a shove inside. "Take a load off, Colonel," he said, his tone dripping with sarcasm. "You might be here for a while." The cell door slammed shut, the sound of the lock clicking echoing like a finality. Marcus sat down on the bench, taking a deep breath to steady himself. He knew he couldn't let his emotions take over. Not now. This wasn't the first time he found himself in a tough spot, and he had learned how to turn adversity into opportunity back in his days in Afghanistan. Outside, Sullivan and Hayes returned to the main area, exchanging a self-satisfied glance. "What do you think about him?" Hayes asked, his hands stuffed in his pockets. "He's probably just a show-off," Sullivan replied, shrugging. "Colonel or not, he still has to back down here." But his tone wasn't as confident as his words. There was something about Marcus's calm demeanor, his fearless gaze, that unsettled him, even if he wouldn't admit it. Meanwhile, Brian Carter sat at the registration desk, his eyes glued to the computer screen. He pulled up the recently entered file and read carefully the line, "Marcus Reynolds, Colonel, United States Army." Something felt familiar. Carter furrowed his brow, muttering, "Where have I heard that name before?" He discreetly pulled out his phone, opened Google, and quickly typed, "Marcus Reynolds Army." The results popped up instantly with an article from Military Times, published a few months ago. The headline jumped out at him. "Colonel Marcus Hawk Reynolds, the silent hero of the Baghdad campaign, now working at the Pentagon." Carter's eyes widened and his heart raced. The article told the story of an outstanding officer who had once commanded hundreds of soldiers in dangerous operations, and who was now a senior advisor at the Pentagon. "Oh, God," Carter whispered, his hands trembling as he set the phone down. He turned his head to look at the cell where Marcus was locked up. This wasn't just any ordinary person. This was a big player, and Sullivan and Hayes had just inadvertently lit a fuse on a ticking bomb. When Brian Carter realized that Marcus was not just an ordinary person, but quiet hero, that was the moment hope flickered in the midst of unjust darkness. Please comment Marcus Unbeatable in the comments to support him. Each of your comments is a spark that fuels Marcus's journey for justice. So let's shine together. In the cramped holding room of the Tampa police station, Colonel Marcus Hawk Reynolds sat still on the metal bench, his back straight, his hands now free after the cuffs were removed. The cold, harsh light from the fluorescent bulb above cast long shadows on the dull gray concrete floor. The room was only 8 feet by 10 feet, but for Marcus, it felt no different than the tight bunkers he'd endured during his campaign in Iraq, where he learned to stay calm even as everything around him fell apart. He took a deep breath. The overpowering smell of disinfectant didn't bother him as much as the weight of injustice pressing down on his heart. But Marcus didn't let his emotions spill over. He knew this was just the beginning, and he needed to conserve his strength for the battle ahead. Outside, the police station's hallway buzzed with the sound of footsteps and chatter. Patrick Sullivan and Daniel Hayes stood near the front desk, about 30 feet from the holding cells, exchanging words with a self-satisfied tone. "Who does he think he is?" Hayes said, arms crossed over his chest. "So what if he's a colonel? Here, we're the law." Sullivan nodded, but there was a flicker of unease in his eyes. "Yeah, but he's way too calm. Not like those guys who usually freak out. I don't like this." He stuffed Marcus's ID card into his jacket pocket, as if keeping it as a trophy. "Anyway, it's done. He's just a name on a file now." A few steps away, Brian Carter sat in front of his computer screen, his heart pounding in his chest. The article from Military Times was still open on his phone, the blue light from the screen casting a glow on his youthful yet now tense face. He skimmed through the description. Colonel Marcus Hawk Reynolds, 42, formerly led the 3rd Battalion, 1st Infantry Division during the Baghdad Liberation Campaign in 2007. Currently a strategic advisor at the Pentagon, Washington, D.C., specializing in military reform and community relations. Carter swallowed hard, his hands trembling as he scrolled down to the next section. A photo of Marcus in his uniform, standing before the U.S. Congress, his sharp gaze reminiscent of someone trapped in a cell. "Damn it," Carter muttered, his voice barely audible, just for him to hear. He turned to look at Sullivan and Hayes, who were chatting and laughing as if nothing was wrong. But for Carter, everything had just changed. This wasn't just a routine arrest. This was a mistake that could shake the entire Tampa Police Department to its core. He knew he had to do something, but his feet felt glued to the chair. Carter had been on the job for less than a year, and facing off against seasoned officers like Sullivan and Hayes was no easy task. In the cell, Marcus heard footsteps approaching. He looked up and saw a small figure through the foggy glass window. It wasn't Sullivan or Hayes, but Carter. The door creaked open, and Carter stepped inside, holding a plastic water bottle. I thought you might need this," he said, his voice hesitant, as he handed the bottle to Marcus. Marcus took it, nodding slightly. "Thank you, Carter." His voice was deep and sincere, his gaze locked onto the young officer, as if trying to read his thoughts. Carter jumped. "You know my name?" "I saw your name tag when I registered," Marcus replied, setting the water bottle down beside him. "You seem different from those other two." Carter blushed, unsure of how to respond. He stood there, hands stuffed in his pockets, and finally spoke in a low voice. "I just looked up your name. Marcus Reynolds, Colonel Reynolds. Are you the one from the Military Times article? The one who used command in Baghdad?" Marcus smiled softly, a smile that wasn't arrogant but felt like a quiet acknowledgement. "I used to be in Baghdad, that's true. But now I'm just a person wrongfully trapped in this room." Carter took a step back, his eyes wide. "Oh my God, if you're really that guy?" Sullivan and Hayes have no idea what they've just done. He turned his head to look down the hallway, where the two officers were still chatting, then turned back to Marcus. "Why didn't you say anything? I mean, you could have stopped them right from the start." Marcus shrugged, his tone calm. "What difference does it make to say it out loud? They made their decision the moment they saw me. I know people like them. Nothing I say will matter until the truth comes to light." Carter fell silent, a mix of admiration and worry evident on his face. He knew Marcus was right. Sullivan and Hayes weren't the type to listen to reason. They acted on instinct and bias, and now they had dug their own grave. "I have to tell someone," Carter said, his voice trembling. "This is bigger than I thought." "Don't rush," Marcus replied, his gaze sharp but not intimidating. "Let them figure out for themselves. I don't need anyone to save me. I just need the truth to come to light." Carter nodded, though inside he was still a whirlwind of emotions. He turned and closed the cell door behind him, but didn't lock it. The sound of his footsteps faded away, leaving Marcus in silence. He sat there, twisting the water bottle in his hands, his mind starting to map out a plan. He knew that his identity was not just a rank. It was a weapon, and now was the time for that weapon to come into play. Outside, Carter returned to the registration desk, his heart still pounding. He glanced over at Sullivan and Hayes, who had now moved to a desk about 20 feet away, filling out reports with indifferent expressions. Carter took a deep breath, reminding himself to stay calm, but he couldn't sit still. He pulled out his phone again, searching for more information about Marcus. Another article popped up, this time from the Washington Post. Colonel Reynolds, the driving force behind military reform, collaborating with the Department of Defense on community issues. Carter was almost breathless. Marcus was not just a battlefield hero. He was a national figure, someone who could shake Tampa to its core if this got out. He looked toward the cell, feeling like he had just stepped into a storm he couldn't control. Meanwhile, Sullivan turned back to look at Carter, frowning. "What's up with that kid?" he asked Hayes. "You're probably just worrying about silly things," Hayes replied, scoffing. "You're new to the game, that's all." But they didn't know that, in a holding room not far away, Marcus was smiling a small, discreet smile full of meaning. The mystery surrounding him was about to explode, and when it did, no one in this police station would be able to maintain that smugness. In the cramped holding room of the Tampa police station, Colonel Marcus Hawk, Reynolds sat quietly on the metal bench, the cold white light from the fluorescent bulb above casting a harsh glow on his face. Despite being wrongfully detained, he maintained an astonishing calmness of quality honed through years of commanding under the pressures of the battlefield. The room was only 8 feet by 10 feet, but to Marcus, it felt like a temporary command center. He knew he was at a disadvantage, but he also understood the art of waiting for the right moment. The sounds of footsteps and voices echoed from the hallway outside like a chaotic soundtrack, yet he refused to let them distract him. His mind was replaying the arrest at Channelside, analyzing every word, every action of Patrick Sullivan and Daniel Hayes to uncover their weaknesses. Outside, about 30 feet from the holding cell, Brian Carter sat at the registration desk, gripping the phone tightly with an article about Marcus on the screen. He had just uncovered the true identity of the man locked up, a U.S. Army colonel, a battlefield hero, and a consultant at the Pentagon. Carter's heart raced, but he hesitated to act. Sullivan and Hayes were still nearby, about 20 feet away, filling out reports with an indifferent attitude. Carter glanced at them, feeling like he was holding a secret that could bring this entire police station crashing down. Sullivan put down his pen and yawned. "The report's done," he said tersely. "That guy thinks he's some kind of VIP, but now he's just sitting still in a cage." Hayes scoffed, fiddling with a ballpoint pen. "Yeah, whether he's a colonel or not, he's nothing here. Let's see how long he can hold up." Carter heard this, and the anger inside him began to boil. He knew Marcus wasn't a liar. He had fully cooperated, yet Sullivan and Hayes still acted as if he were a dangerous criminal. Carter took a deep breath, deciding he needed to do something. He stood up, walked toward the two officers, his voice hesitant but firm. "Hey, Sullivan, Hayes, I think we need to talk about this." Sullivan turned back, frowning. "What's up, kid? Are you done with your work, or are you just messing around?" Carter swallowed hard, gripping the edge of the table. I looked up his name, Marcus Reynolds. He's not an ordinary guy. He's a colonel in the Army, previously commanded in Baghdad, and now he works at the Pentagon. We might have made a huge mistake. Hayes laughed, but the sound was dry and forced. "Pentagon? Are you reading science fiction, Carter? He's just a con man in a suit." "No," Carter replied, his voice firmer. He pulled out his phone and turned the screen toward them. "Here, read this." Military times. That's him. If this gets out, we're done for. Sullivan snatched the phone, scrolling through the article with a growing scowl. He tossed the phone back to Carter, his voice tight with irritation. You think I care? He resisted. We did everything by the book. Don't make a big deal out of this, kid. Carter stepped back, but his gaze never left Sullivan. He didn't resist. I was there. I saw everything. You guys arrested him without a clear reason. If he sues, this whole department is going to pay for it. The atmosphere between them suddenly grew tense. Sullivan stepped forward, standing less than 2 feet away from Carter, his eyes blazing. You think you can teach me how to do my job? I've been here for 15 years, kid. You haven't even been here a year. Know your place. Carter stood firm, even though his heart was pounding. I'm not teaching you. I'm just stating the truth. He's not someone we can take lightly. In the jail cell, Marcus heard the sound of an argument echoing in. He smiled slightly, knowing Carter was doing exactly what he hoped, planting seeds of doubt. He knew the truth about himself would soon come to light, but he wasn't in a hurry. This was a tactic he had used in Afghanistan, letting the enemy get tangled up in their own confusion before delivering the final blow. Outside, Hayes chimed in, his tone conciliatory yet laced with sarcasm. Come on, Sullivan. This kid is just too worried. Let me go check on him, and we can wrap this up quickly. He stood up and walked toward the cell, the keys jingling in his hand. Sullivan growled but didn't stop him. When Hayes opened the cell door, Marcus looked up, his sharp gaze locking onto him. Hayes smirked, leaning against the doorframe. Feeling comfortable, Colonel? I heard you were a hero in Baghdad. What about now? Just a guy in handcuffs. Marcus didn't respond right away. He stood up, towering over Hayes by nearly 6 inches, his presence radiating authority even without a uniform. I face far more dangerous men than you, he said, his voice deep like distant thunder. And I'm still standing here. You should think carefully about this. Hayes stiffened, his smile fading away. There was something in Marcus's voice that wasn't threatening, but rather a certainty that made him feel small. Are you trying to scare me? He growled, gripping the bunch of keys tightly. No, Marcus replied, stepping closer, just 3 feet away from Hayes. I'm just speaking the truth. You and your colleagues have just ignited something that you can't control. Hayes stepped back, his gaze wavering. He turned and slammed the cell door shut, but the sound of the lock didn't follow. Marcus heard his hurried footsteps fading away, and he knew the seed of doubt had taken root. The cell door slammed shut behind Daniel Hayes, but the sound of the lock didn't echo like it had before. Colonel Marcus Hawk. Reynolds stood still in the cramped 8-foot by 10-foot space, his sharp gaze following Hayes' hurried silhouette through the frosted glass. He sensed a tremor in Hayes' voice, a tiny crack in the facade of feigned confidence. Marcus was all too familiar with this feeling. He had seen it on the faces of rookies in Baghdad when they realized they had just stepped into a situation that was beyond their control. He sat down on the metal bench, took a deep breath, letting the stifling air of the room settle in his chest. The real battle hadn't begun yet, but he had already planted the necessary seed. Outside, about 30 feet from the cell, Hayes hurried toward Patrick Sullivan, his face flushed with a mix of anger and confusion. He stopped in front of the desk where Sullivan was sitting, slamming his hand down on the surface, causing the pen to roll off and hit the floor. He just said something weird. Hayes growled, his eyes darting over to Brian Carter, who was still standing near the registration desk, watching everything with a tense expression. He said, we can't control this. What do you think, Sullivan? Sullivan looked up, furrowing his brow, but his tone remained nonchalant. So what? He's just trying to scare you. Don't let his words shake you. He stood up, towering over Hayes by about 3 inches, and glanced toward the cell. Let me handle this. I'll show him who's really in charge here. Carter stepped in, his voice trembling but resolute. Don't, Sullivan. I'm serious. He's not an ordinary guy. If you push this too far, it's going to blow up bigger than we ever imagined. Sullivan turned back, stepping closer to Carter, standing less than 2 feet away from him. Have you said enough, kid? He growled, his voice dripping with menace. I don't need some punk teaching me how to do my job. He's in the cage now, it's over. But before Sullivan could take a step, The phone at the front desk rang, cutting through the tense atmosphere. Carter quickly picked up the receiver, his gaze flicking between Sullivan and Hayes. "Tampa Police Department. This is Carter," he said, his voice trying to stay calm. On the other end was a frantic female voice, the manager of the sale pavilion, the restaurant where Marcus had just left before being arrested. "You're holding a guy named Marcus Reynolds, right?" she asked, her voice trembling. "I just saw a video online of someone recording when he was arrested at Channelside. The whole neighborhood is buzzing. He's a regular at our place. A good guy. What are you doing?" Carter stiffened, gripping the receiver tightly. "We're handling it, ma'am," he replied, his voice hesitant. "Thank you for letting us know." He hung up, turned to Sullivan and Hayes with a look of panic. Someone recorded the arrest. It's spreading out there. Sullivan laughed, but the sound was dry and forced. "Video? Those damn phones are always causing trouble. Whatever, nobody cares anyway." "No," Carter interrupted, his voice firmer. "People know who he is. If this gets to the press, or worse, the Pentagon, you guys won't be laughing anymore." Hayes stepped back, running his hand over his face as if he had just realized something. "Are you serious, Carter? You mean he could actually get us into trouble?" Carter nodded, his gaze fixed on the two officers. "I told you. He's a colonel, once commanded in Baghdad, now working at the Pentagon. Do you really think they'll just stand by while someone like him is treated this way?" Sullivan clenched his fist, but this time he didn't respond right away. He turned his head to look at the cell where Marcus sat, a silent figure radiating power. There was something in Carter's words that made him start to doubt, even though he didn't want to admit it. "All right," he said, his voice dropping. "Let me go over there and see what he wants. But I warn you, Carter, don't make a big deal out of this." He walked toward the cell, each step heavy with unease. When Sullivan opened the door, Marcus looked up, his gaze calm yet sharp as a knife. "Back so soon, Sullivan?" he asked, his voice steady and devoid of sarcasm. Sullivan leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed over his chest. "Listen up, Reynolds. Who do you think you are, trying to intimidate us? Colonel or not, I'm the law around here." Marcus stood up, slowly but decisively, his tall frame filling the small space of the cell. He stepped forward, stopping about 3 feet from Sullivan, his gaze unwavering. "I'm not threatening you," he said, his voice like the wind before a storm. "I'm just stating the truth. You arrested me without cause, and now you'll have to face the consequences. Not from me, but from what you brought upon yourself." Sullivan stiffened, his hands clenched into fists. There was a moment of silence, taut as a string, as if both of them were standing on the brink of a much larger confrontation. But then Sullivan turned away, slamming the door shut without saying another word. He didn't want to admit it, but Marcus's words had struck a deep fear within him. Outside the station, about a mile away, Henry Brooks, a Vietnam War veteran who witnessed the arrest, stood among a small crowd in Channelside. He held up his phone, the video he recorded playing repeatedly on the screen. Marcus handcuffed, shoved into a patrol car, despite not resisting at all. "I know him," he said to the crowd, his voice trembling with anger. "He's a good man, someone who served this country. We can't let this go." The crowd began to buzz, voices spreading like ripples across Tampa Bay. One person shouted, "Get him out of there!" Another held up their phone, streaming live on social media. News of the arrest of Colonel Marcus Reynolds, U.S. Army, was spreading like wildfire. In the cell, Marcus sat down, his gaze staring into the void. He knew the storm was coming, and he was ready. This wasn't just his fight. It was a battle for justice, waiting for the moment to explode. The atmosphere that afternoon in Tampa, Florida, felt heavier than usual. The sun hung high in the sky, casting harsh rays down onto Tampa Bay, making the water shimmer like a giant mirror. But in the Channelside area, about a mile from the Tampa police station, no one paid attention to that beauty. A small crowd was gathering near the corner of Channelside Drive and Franklin Street, where Colonel Marcus Hawk Reynolds had been wrongfully arrested just a few hours earlier. Whispers filled the air, mingling with the gentle lapping of waves from the nearby Hillsborough River. It all started with a video clip. Henry Brooks, a Vietnam War veteran with silver hair and a slight limp, stood in the crowd, holding up an old phone high in the air. The video he recorded played repeatedly on the screen. Marcus, dressed in a dark gray suit, was handcuffed by Patrick Sullivan and Daniel Hayes, being shoved into a patrol car despite not resisting at all. Henry's voice trembled with anger as he spoke to those around him. "I know him," he declared, his gaze sweeping over the crowd of about 20 people. "Marcus Reynolds is not a criminal. He's a soldier who fought for this country. I've seen him in this neighborhood countless times, always polite, always kind. You see, they arrested him without any reason." A middle-aged woman, wearing a Tampa Bay Rays logo t-shirt, stepped closer, her eyes wide with astonishment. "Is that really a military colonel?" she asked, her voice filled with wonder. "I just saw the video on Facebook. It's going viral." Henry nodded, pointing at the screen. "That's right, and we can't let them lock him up like that. It's just not fair." The crowd began to buzz with excitement. A young man, around 25 years old, wearing a hoodie, raised his phone to stream live. "Hey everyone, I'm at Channelside," he said to the hundreds of viewers online. "The police just arrested an Army colonel for no reason. We need to do something." His voice rang out, stirring the atmosphere like a gust of wind fanning the embers of a smoldering fire. Meanwhile, about 4 miles away at MacDill Air Force Base, home to U.S. Central Command CENTCOM, news was starting to spread as well. Sergeant Jamal Carter, not related to Brian Carter, a black soldier who had served under Marcus in Iraq, was sitting in the break room with a few teammates. He was scrolling through his phone when he suddenly jumped up after seeing a video on Twitter. "Damn it! That's Colonel Reynolds," he exclaimed, his voice filled with outrage. "Which colonel?" another soldier asked, looking up from his cup of coffee. "Colonel Hawk Reynolds," Jamal replied, pointing at the screen. "The guy who saved our entire battalion in Baghdad back in 2007. Look at this. The Tampa police arrested him this morning. Unbelievable." The whole group of soldiers gathered around Jamal, watching the video with expressions ranging from shock to anger. They dared to capture Colonel Hawk? A female soldier named Lisa Torres said, her voice trembling, "He's a legend. We have to do something." Jamal nodded, his eyes blazing with intensity. "I'm going to call the Veterans of Foreign Wars, VFW. They need to know about this. The colonel doesn't deserve to be treated like that." He pulled out his phone, dialed the number for the Tampa VFW branch, determined to turn his outrage into action. Back at Channelside, the crowd had grown larger, from 20 people to nearly 50 in just 30 minutes. News spread like wildfire on social media, with Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram buzzing with the hashtag Justice for Marcus. A group of high school students, just released from Blake High School 2 miles away, joined the crowd, raising their phones to film and chanting slogans. "Let him go," a girl shouted, her voice echoing down the street. Henry Brooks, despite his age, still led the group, his voice stronger than ever. "I've called a few friends at the VFW," he told the crowd. "They're on their way. We're heading to the police station to demand justice for Marcus." The crowd roared. Applause thundered like a storm. An older man, wearing a jacket with USMC, United States Marine Corps, printed on it, stepped closer to Henry. "I'm Tom Rivera." He introduced himself in a deep voice. "I met Colonel Reynolds at a military event a few years back. If that's really him, we can't just sit back." Henry shook Tom's hand, his eyes shining with hope. "Thank you, Tom. The more, the better. We'll show them the strength of our community." Meanwhile, at the Tampa police station, Brian Carter stood behind the front desk, his hands trembling as he watched the views on the video spike past 10,000 in just 1 hour. He turned to Patrick Sullivan and Daniel Hayes, who were sitting 20 feet away, still joking around nonchalantly. "You guys don't get it," Carter said, his voice urgent. "People are gathering out there because of Marcus. This isn't just a small deal anymore." Sullivan smirked, his tone dripping with sarcasm. "Gathering? Just a bunch of bored guys making videos. They'll get tired of it real quick." "No," Carter interrupted, pointing out the front window of the station, about 50 feet from the front desk. "Look." Sullivan and Hayes reluctantly stood up and walked to the window. Through the glass, they saw a crowd of about 60 people making their way toward the station from the Channelside direction. Less than half a mile away, the shouts echoed, "Free Marcus! Justice for the Colonel!" A few people held up handwritten signs. "Don't take our soldier." Hayes's face went pale as he rubbed his face. "Damn it! What the hell is going on?" Sullivan clenched his fist. But this time he wasn't smiling anymore. "Those damn guys are filming," he muttered, his voice filled with anger. "But they can't do anything. We have the right to be here." Carter shook his head, his eyes filled with concern. "Your rights can't overpower the whole community. And what if the military steps in, like VFW or MacDill?" In the cell, Marcus heard the commotion from outside, faintly echoing through the thick wall. He stood up and walked over to the small window, trying to see out. He couldn't make out anything clearly, but the chant "Justice for Marcus" rang in his ears like a beacon. He smiled softly, not a triumphant grin, but one of faith. The community had risen up, and he knew he was no longer alone. The sky over Tampa gradually turned a soft orange as the sun dipped down toward the bay. But that light did nothing to ease the tense atmosphere enveloping the Tampa Police Department on North Morgan Street. The crowd from Channelside had grown, now swelling from 60 to over 100 people, gathered about 50 feet from the station's front door. Shouts echoed through the air, mingling with distant sirens and the sound of waves crashing from the Hillsborough River a mile away. "Free Marcus! Justice for the Colonel!" The chant rang out, powerful like the beat of a war drum. Handwritten signs were held high. "Don't arrest our hero!" and "Tampa demands justice" glimmered in the dim light of the evening. Henry Brooks stood at the front of the crowd, his legs unsteady, but his voice resonating like that of a seasoned leader. He raised his phone, the video now surpassing 50,000 views on social media, with the hashtag Justice for Marcus trending on Twitter in Florida. "We're not leaving until they release Marcus Reynolds." Henry shouted, and the crowd erupted in cheers. Beside him, Tom Rivera, a former Marine, raised his hand, signaling for silence. "I just called the VFW branch in Tampa," he said, his voice deep yet firm. "They're sending people over. This isn't just our fight. It's the fight of everyone who has ever served." The crowd erupted into applause once again, but the atmosphere grew even more tense as a group of small trucks approached from the south. Members of the Veterans of Foreign Wars, VFW, Tampa, wearing jackets emblazoned with their logo, stepped out with serious expressions. Leading the group was a woman in her 50s, with short silver-dyed hair, wearing a VFW badge on her chest. She introduced herself to Henry. "I'm Diane Miller, president of the VFW Tampa chapter. We heard that Colonel Marcus Reynolds has been arrested. Is that true?" Henry nodded, handing his phone to Diane to watch the video. "That's right. He's one of the best I've ever met. They locked him up for no reason." Diane watched the video, her eyes narrowing in anger. "Colonel Hawk Reynolds," she murmured, her voice filled with respect. "I met him at a military conference last year. If they dare to touch him, they'll pay the price." She turned to the group of about 20 VFW members and commanded succinctly, "Get the banners ready. We're staying here until he's released." Meanwhile, from MacDill Air Force Base, just 4 miles away, Sergeant Jamal Carter and Lisa Torres had left the base, driving their Jeep straight to the police station. Jamal gripped the steering wheel tightly, his eyes blazing. "Colonel Hawk saved my life in Baghdad," he said to Lisa, his voice choked with emotion. "One time a bomb went off near our station, and he pulled me out of the rubble. I owe him." Lisa nodded, her phone in hand as she connected with her teammates at MacDill. "I just messaged a few people at CENTCOM. They're escalating it to higher-ups. If the Pentagon catches wind of this, Sullivan and Hayes won't get away with it." When Jamal's car arrived at the station, the crowd had swelled to 150 people, stretching from a main entrance to the corner of North Morgan Street and Franklin Street. Jamal and Lisa jumped out, joining the ranks alongside Henry and Diane. Jamal saluted Diane in a military style, introducing himself. "Sergeant Jamal Carter, formerly served under Colonel Reynolds. We're here to help." Diane shook Jamal's hand, her eyes lighting up. "Thank you, Sergeant. Your presence is going to scare them." Inside the Tampa police station, the chaotic atmosphere gradually replaced the initial indifference. Brian Carter stood behind the front desk, his eyes glued to the computer screen where the video views had surpassed 100,000, and the comments demanding Marcus's release kept flooding in. He turned to Patrick Sullivan and Daniel Hayes, who were now standing near the front window, about 50 feet away, gazing out at the crowd with bewildered expressions. "I told you guys," Carter said, his voice urgent. "This is no longer a minor issue. There are VFW members and soldiers from MacDill out there." Sullivan turned back, slamming his hand against the wall. "Damn it, what are those veterans doing here?" He stepped closer to Carter, his voice low and growling. "Did you tip them off, kid?" "No," Carter replied, his gaze unwavering. "The video is spreading, and people are coming on their own. Can't you see? They know who Marcus is, a colonel, a hero. You've poked the hornet's nest." Hayes stepped back, running his hand through his hair, his voice trembling. "If the military really intervenes, we're done for. The Pentagon doesn't mess around, Sullivan." Sullivan clenched his fists, but this time he didn't argue back. He turned to the window, watching the crowd now holding up banners. "Free Colonel Hawk and justice for the soldier." The chants rose like waves, crashing against the thick glass of the police station. He felt sweat bead on his forehead. For the first time that day, he was no longer confident. In the cell, Marcus heard the noise growing louder. He stood up, walked over to the small window, straining to catch every sound. Justice for Marcus. That voice wasn't just one person. It was the voice of a whole community. He smiled a small, subtle smile, but it was full of meaning. He knew the community had risen up, and their strength was greater than any wall in this room. Outside, Diane Miller held a megaphone, her voice cutting through the noise. "We are the American Veterans Association, representing those who have served this country. Marcus Reynolds is a soldier, a hero, and we demand his immediate release." The crowd cheered, applause booming like thunder. Jamal Carter stepped up, saluting the crowd in a military style. "I am Sergeant Jamal Carter. I fought alongside Colonel Hawk in Iraq. He is not a criminal. He is someone we owe a debt to. Release him." The shout, "Let him go," rang out again, stronger than ever. Henry Brooks, though exhausted, stood firm, his eyes shining with hope. "We're not leaving," he said to Tom Rivera. "Not until Marcus is free." Tom nodded, his voice deep. "This isn't just Marcus's story. This is the story of all of us who have been overlooked by the system." Inside the station, Sullivan turned to look at Hayes and Carter, his voice now tinged with a hint of panic. How could this get so big? It was just an arrest. Carter shook his head, his gaze unwavering. "No, Sullivan, you've got the wrong guy, and now the whole of Tampa is rallying behind him. You can't ignore this any longer." The sound of the crowd outside grew louder, like an unstoppable tidal wave. Marcus, from his cell, closed his eyes and took a deep breath. He felt the strength of Henry, of Jamal, of Diane, of all the people who had never met him but still believed in justice. He whispered to himself, "Thank you all. The storm has arrived, and it won't stop until justice is served." As night falls over Tampa, Florida, the city is draped in a thick black curtain, punctuated by the flickering glow of streetlights. Outside the Tampa police station on North Morgan Street, a crowd of over 150 people stands resolutely, undeterred by the slight chill wafting in from Tampa Bay a mile away. The chants of "Free Marcus," "Justice for the Colonel," echo relentlessly, now blending with the voice of Diane Miller, president of VFW Tampa, and the applause of veterans, service members from MacDill Air Force Base, along with the residents of Channelside. This crowd is not just a group of protesters. They are a collective force, a blazing fire demanding the truth. Inside the precinct, the atmosphere of chaos had replaced the initial complacency. Brian Carter stood behind the front desk, his eyes glued to the computer screen. With the views of the video capturing the arrest of Marcus Reynolds had surpassed 200,000 on social media. The hashtag Justice for Marcus was now not just trending in Florida, but had spread to neighboring states. He turned to Patrick Sullivan and Daniel Hayes, who were standing about 20 feet away near the window, gazing out at the crowd with expressions that were both angry and bewildered. "I told you," Carter said, his voice urgent yet firm. This is beyond your control. There are VFW members, soldiers from MacDill, and the public out there. You can't ignore this any longer." Sullivan turned back, slamming his hand down on the table, causing the old coffee cup to tip over. "You think I'm afraid of that crowd, Carter?" he shouted, his voice dripping with defiance. "We're doing things by the book. He resisted, we took care of it." "He didn't resist," Carter replied, his gaze unwavering. "I saw everything. You guys arrested him out of prejudice, not because of the law. And now all of Tampa knows about it." Hayes interjected, his voice trembling as he wiped his face. "If the military really gets involved, Sullivan, we're done for. The Pentagon isn't playing around. Do you see that crowd? There are even soldiers from MacDill in there." Sullivan clenched his fists, but this time he didn't immediately argue back. He walked over to the window, 50 feet away from the registration desk, and looked out at the crowd, which had now unfurled banners reading, "Justice for Colonel Hawk." Diane's voice boomed to the loudspeaker. "We won't leave until Marcus Reynolds is released." He felt sweat trickling down his spine. For the first time in his 15-year career, he truly felt the pressure. In the small 8-foot by 10-foot cell, Marcus sat on the metal bench, his hands clasped together, his gaze fixed on the ceiling as if deep in thought. He could hear the shouts from outside, muffled by the thick walls. Justice for Marcus. That voice wasn't just Henry Brooks, Jamal Carter, or Diane Miller. It was the voice of a whole community that believed in him. He knew they were fighting for him, and that warmed his heart, even though he was still trapped in this cold cage. But Marcus was in a hurry. He had learned from his days in Baghdad. The most crucial moment is when the enemy reveals their weakness. Outside the hallway, Brian Carter left the registration desk, determined to take action. He quickly walked toward the office of Lieutenant Sarah Mitchell, a recently transferred officer to Tampa known for her fairness and toughness. Sarah's office was at the end of the hallway, about 40 feet from the holding cells, a small room with frosted glass and a nameplate that read Lieutenant Sarah Mitchell. Carter knocked on the door, his heart pounding. "Come in," Sarah's voice rang out, deep and calm. Carter pushed the door open and stepped inside, seeing Sarah sitting behind her desk, her eyes glued to the computer screen. She was about 35, with neatly tied brown hair and sharp eyes that radiated intelligence. "What's going on, Carter?" she asked, looking up at him. Carter took a deep breath, his voice urgent. "Lieutenant, we have a big problem. Marcus Reynolds, the guy Sullivan and Hayes picked up this morning, isn't just an Army colonel. I dug up some info. He used command in Baghdad and is currently working at the Pentagon. And now, there are protests happening out in Tampa because of him." Sarah frowned and set her pen down on the table. "Army colonel? Pentagon? Are you sure about this, Carter?" "Sure," Carter replied, handing the phone to Sarah with the article from Military Times. "Here, but I think there's more to it than that. I heard he's involved in a major project with the Department of Defense, some kind of investigation. If that's true, this arrest isn't just a mistake, it's a disaster." Sarah picked up her phone, scrolling through the article at an astonishing speed. Her eyes narrowed as she read the section. Colonel Marcus Hawk Reynolds, a strategic advisor to the Pentagon, specializing in military reform and community relations. She set her phone down, her gaze turning icy. If he's the one, why were Sullivan and Hayes stupid enough to capture him without checking? Carter shook his head. "They don't care, Lieutenant. They see a black man in a suit and act on their biases. But now the video has gone viral, and the crowd out there includes the VFW with soldiers from MacDill. We have to do something." Sarah stood up and walked over to the small window in the office, about 10 feet from her desk, looking out at the crowd in the distance. The chant "Free Marcus" echoed in, though faintly through the glass. She turned back, her voice firm. "Take me to him. I need to hear the story straight from him." Carter nodded, leading Sarah out of the office, quickly walking down the hallway toward the holding cell. As they passed the front desk, Sullivan and Hayes noticed them, their expressions filled with suspicion. "Where's Carter taking Mitchell?" Hayes whispered, his voice tinged with worry. "I don't know," Sullivan replied, his hands clenched tight. "But I don't like this." When Sarah and Carter arrived at the cell, Sarah opened the door and stepped in with an air of authority. Marcus looked up, his calm yet piercing gaze locking onto her. "Colonel Marcus Reynolds?" Sarah asked, her voice low but clear. "That's right," Marcus replied, standing up, towering over Sarah by nearly 6 inches. "I guess you're not Sullivan or Hayes." Sarah smiled softly, but her eyes were serious. "I'm Lieutenant Sarah Mitchell. I just heard about your case. I want to hear the truth from you." Marcus nodded, his voice steady and low. "I was arrested this morning at Channelside for no reason. I cooperated fully, but they still handcuffed me and locked me up here. That's the truth." Sarah furrowed her brow, her gaze sweeping over Marcus as if seeking confirmation. "Carter said you work at the Pentagon. Is that true?" Marcus smiled a subtle, meaningful smile. "That's right. But I think you want to know more than that, don't you?" Sarah tilted her head, her voice dropping. "If you're the person I think you are, then this isn't just a case of mistaken identity. What are you doing in Tampa, Colonel?" Marcus looked straight into her eyes, his voice now carrying a different weight. "I'm working for the Department of Defense on a federal investigation into discrimination within local law enforcement agencies. And this arrest? It just became my biggest piece of evidence." Sarah froze, her breath catching for a moment. The secret had just been revealed, and she knew the real storm was only just beginning. The atmosphere in the small 8-foot by 10-foot jail cell of the Tampa Police Department suddenly became more suffocating as Colonel Marcus Hawk, Reynolds' voice rang out, deep yet powerful like the crack of a gunshot. "I'm working for the Department of Defense on a federal investigation into discrimination within local law enforcement agencies. And this arrest? It just became my biggest piece of evidence." Lieutenant Sarah Mitchell stood across from him, her sharp eyes widening for a moment before quickly regaining her composure. But Marcus sensed she had just been swept up in a whirlwind she never saw coming. Sarah took a deep breath, lowering her voice so only he and Brian Carter, who was standing behind her, could hear. "Are you serious, Colonel? A federal investigation? Here in Tampa?" Marcus nodded, his gaze fixed on her. "It's true. I didn't come here just to relax. I was assigned to gather data on incidents, reports, anything that shows the system is failing the people. And this morning, Sullivan and Hayes handed me a perfect case study." He smiled slightly, not in a triumphant way, but like a soldier who knows he's just gained an advantage on the battlefield. Sarah turned to Carter, her gaze sharp. "You heard that. If he's telling the truth, we're standing on a ticking time bomb. Get me out of here. I need to talk to Sullivan and Hayes right now." Carter nodded, leading Sarah out of the cell, the door slamming shut behind them with a harsh thud. Marcus sat down on the bench, his hands clasped together, his gaze fixed on the ceiling. He heard the chants in the crowd outside, "Justice for Marcus," and knew that the pressure from the community was tightening its grip around this police station. But he wasn't in a hurry. He had waited for hours in ambushes in Afghanistan. This was just another battlefield. The hallway of the police station was now filled with tension. Sarah hurried toward the main area, 40 feet away from the holding cells, with Carter right behind her. As they passed the front desk, Patrick Sullivan and Daniel Hayes were still standing near the front window, about 50 feet away, gazing out at the crowd that had now swelled to over 200 people. Diane Miller's voice blared over the loudspeaker. "We know who he is, a soldier, a colonel. Release Marcus Reynolds now." Sullivan turned around, his eyes blazing as he spotted Sarah and Carter approaching. "Mitchell, what the hell is going on?" Sullivan shouted, stepping within 5 feet of Sarah. "What did you and that kid just do in there?" Sarah crossed her arms, her voice icy. "I just spoke with Marcus Reynolds. Do you have any idea who you've captured?" Hayes interjected, his voice trembling. "Colonel, or whatever, right? Carter keeps rambling on about that. But we did everything by the book. He resisted." Sarah shook her head, her sharp gaze sweeping over both of them. "No, he didn't resist. And he's not just a colonel. He's working for the Department of Defense on a federal investigation into discrimination in the local police. You two just made yourselves as prime targets." Sullivan laughed, but the sound was dry and forced. "The federal government? Are you kidding me, Mitchell? He's just making stuff up to get out of this." No, Sarah interrupted. Her voice is hard as steel. I pulled his records through Carter. Marcus Reynolds is an advisor at the Pentagon, formerly in command in Baghdad. He has direct connections with the Department of Defense and the FBI, if he's telling the truth, and I believe he is in you all just put this whole department in serious trouble. Hayes paled, running his fingers through his messy hair. FBI? Damn it, Sullivan, if the feds get involved, we're done for. I told you this whole thing was weird. Sullivan clenched his fist and stepped closer to Sarah, his voice tense. You believe what he says without checking it out? I'm not afraid of those scare tactics. We have reports of him resisting, and I'll prove it. Sarah stood her ground, her gaze locked onto Sullivan. Your report is worthless without evidence. The video out there shows he didn't resist, and thousands have seen it. And if the FBI comes here, they'll uncover every wrongdoing, every dark secret you've ever hidden. Do you want to take that bet? The atmosphere between them was tense, like a tightly strung guitar string, as if even a tiny spark could set everything off. Carter stood behind Sarah, his hands trembling but his gaze steady. He knew Sarah was right. He had seen the video, heard Marcus, and he felt the weight of the truth. Outside, the crowd was growing larger by the minute, their cheers drowning out the sound of wind from Tampa Bay. Jamal Carter, a sergeant from MacDill, raised his hand in a military salute to Diane Miller, his voice booming through the loudspeaker. Colonel Hawk is not a criminal. He's our hero. We will not back down. Henry Brooks, standing beside him, held up a sign high, Justice for the Soldier. Inside the station, the noise from the crowd filtered through the glass, causing Sullivan to turn and look. He saw the silhouettes of Diane, Jamal, and dozens of veterans illuminated by the flickering streetlights. Damn it, he muttered, his voice tinged with a hint of panic. How did this get so big? Sarah stepped closer to Sullivan, her voice dropping but filled with authority. Because you picked the wrong person to arrest. I'm going to report this to Chief of Police Carver. You all better get ready. Everything is about to change. She turned on her heel, signaling for Carter to follow, and walked toward her office. Sullivan stood there, fists clenched, his gaze wavering between anger and fear. Hayes backed away, plopping down into a chair, whispering, If the feds really come, I don't want to be involved, Sullivan. You're on your own. In the cell, Marcus heard the distant footsteps of Sarah and Carter fading away. He closed his eyes, took a deep breath, feeling the rhythm of his heart sync with the shouts from outside. He knew his secret had been revealed, and now was the time for it to unleash its power. He whispered to himself, They have no idea I've been preparing for this day for a long time. The pressure in the police station was mounting, like a storm gathering strength. Sullivan and Hayes began to feel the weight of their actions, but they still had no idea that the storm was not just coming from the crowd, but from the very heart of power in Washington, D.C. If you feel your heart racing with the power of justice in this moment, as Marcus turns injustice into a flame of change, please hit like and subscribe to the Legendary Narratives channel right now. We need you to help spread this story so that justice is not just a word, but the action of all of us. The night in Tampa, Florida, was no longer peaceful. The streetlights flickered on North Morgan Street, illuminating a crowd of over 200 people gathered in front of the Tampa Police Department, just 50 feet from the main entrance. The chants of Free Marcus, Justice for the Colonel, rang out continuously, blending with the sound of Diane Miller's megaphone and the applause of VFW veterans, servicemen from MacDill Air Force Base and the residents of Channelside. A chilly breeze from Tampa Bay, a mile away, swept through, but no one in the crowd had any intention of leaving. They stood there, resolute like soldiers on the front lines, waiting for justice. Inside the station, the chaotic atmosphere had turned into a panic. Patrick Sullivan stood near the front window, about 50 feet from the front desk, his hands trembling as he watched the crowd grow larger. Daniel Hayes slumped in his chair, cradling his head, whispering, We're done for, Sullivan. The feds, the FBI, the Pentagon, did you hear Mitchell? I don't want to be part of this. Sullivan turned back, his eyes blazing. Shut up, Hayes. We didn't do anything wrong. The report will prove he resisted. They don't have any evidence. But his voice wasn't as confident as before. The shouts from outside, Justice for Colonel Hawk. pierced through the glass, making him feel like the walls of the police station were closing around him. Lieutenant Sarah Mitchell hurried from the office to the main area, with Brian Carter right behind her. She had just left the interrogation room of Marcus Reynolds, where he revealed his role in the Department of Defense's federal investigation. Sarah stopped in front of the registration desk, her sharp gaze sweeping over Sullivan and Hayes. "Do you guys still not get it?" she said, her voice icy. "This isn't a game anymore. Marcus Reynolds isn't just a colonel. He's a living witness in an investigation that could take this whole system down. And you've handed him right over to feds." Sullivan stepped forward, standing less than 3 feet away from Sarah, his voice tense. "You want me to believe he's some kind of spy? I'm not afraid of the FBI, Mitchell. We have the right to arrest people." Sarah smiled coldly, her gaze unwavering. "Your power means nothing when the video out there proves he's innocent. And if the FBI comes, when the FBI arrives, they'll dig up everything. You think you're so clean, Sullivan?" The atmosphere between them was tense, like a tightly strung guitar string. But before Sullivan could respond, a loud knock echoed from the front door of the station, about 60 feet away from the main area. Everyone turned, their eyes filled with confusion. Carter stepped forward, opened the door, and a tall man walked in. He was dressed in a black suit, wearing sunglasses even though it was dark outside, and the badge on his chest gleamed under the fluorescent lights. Special Agent David Torres, FBI. Sarah froze. Carter stepped back, while Sullivan and Hayes stood frozen in place. Torres walked in, his stride confident, his gaze sweeping across the room like a hunting hawk. "I'm Agent David Torres, FBI Tampa," he said, his voice deep and clear. "I'm here regarding the Marcus Reynolds case." "Who's in charge here?" Sarah stepped forward, her voice calm yet commanding. "I am Lieutenant Sarah Mitchell. I'm handling this case. He's being locked up in a cell without just cause." Torres nodded, his gaze shifting to Sullivan and Hayes. "So, who are you guys?" "The ones who took Colonel Reynolds." Sullivan swallowed hard, trying to maintain a tough exterior. "I'm Patrick Sullivan. This is Daniel Hayes. We arrested him for resisting during the stop. Everything is by the book." Torres smirked, his smile devoid of warmth. "By the book? I've watched the video, and so have over 300,000 others." He didn't resist. "But I'm not here to argue with you. I'm here because Marcus Reynolds is a federal asset, and you just jeopardized a months-long investigation." Hayes went pale, his voice trembling. "Federal assets? What do you mean by that?" Torres stepped forward, standing less than 2 feet away from Hayes, his voice low but laced with menace. "What I mean is Colonel Reynolds is working undercover for the Department of Defense and the FBI. We're investigating systemic discrimination in local police departments, including Tampa. This arrest isn't just a mistake. It's a gold mine, and you guys are at the center of it." Sullivan stepped back, his hands trembling. "You're making this up. We don't know anything about that stuff." Torres pulled a stack of documents from his briefcase and slammed it down on the registration desk with a thud. "This is an order from Central Command at MacDill, signed by Major General Richard Evans, Reynolds' direct superior. You have 10 minutes to release him, or I'll call in a special ops team. Choose wisely." Sarah held the stack of documents, flipping through them at an astonishing speed. She turned to Sullivan, her voice icy. "I warned you. Now you'll face the consequences." Outside, the crowd spotted Torres through the glass. Jamal Carter shouted over the loudspeaker, "The FBI is here. They're going to release Colonel Hawk." Cheers erupted, drowning out the sound of the night wind. Henry Brooks embraced Diane Miller, his voice choked with emotion. "We did it." In the cell, Marcus heard the commotion and hurried footsteps from the hallway. He stood up, his gaze calm yet sharp. He knew his moment had come. The door swung open, and Sarah walked in, followed by Torres. "Colonel Reynolds," Torres said, his voice filled with respect. "I'm Special Agent David Torres, FBI. We're here to get you out of here." Marcus nodded, his gaze locked onto Torres. "Thank you, Agent. But I want to make sure this case doesn't get swept under the rug. This is the evidence we need." Torres smiled gently. "Don't worry. We have the video, your testimony, and both of those officers. The investigation will continue, and Tampa will be the starting point. Sarah stepped in, her voice low. I'll make sure they don't get away, Colonel. This is my battle now, too. Marcus looked at her and nodded slightly. Thank you, Lieutenant. I know I can trust you. Outside in the hallway, Sullivan and Hayes stood frozen as they watched Torres lead Marcus out. Sullivan clenched his fist, but didn't dare say a word. Hayes whispered, "We're really done for." As Marcus stepped out of the jail cell, the cheers in the crowd outside roared like thunder. He took a deep breath, feeling the strength of the community and the truth standing by his side. The storm from Washington had arrived, and it wouldn't stop until everything was laid bare. The night in Tampa, Florida, now carries an intense vibe. The streetlights flicker on North Morgan Street, illuminating a crowd of over 200 people standing just 50 feet from the main entrance of the Tampa Police Department. The chants of "Free Marcus," "Justice for the Colonel," thunder like a storm, blending with Diane Miller's megaphone and the applause of VFW veterans, service members from MacDill Air Force Base, and local residents. But inside the station, the atmosphere isn't one of victory. It's a brewing internal storm ready to erupt. Agent David Torres stood in the main area, 20 feet away from the reception desk, the FBI badge gleaming on his black vest. A stack of documents from Central Command, CENTCOM, lay on the table, serving as an undeniable indictment. In front of him was Lieutenant Sarah Mitchell, who had just confirmed Marcus's role in the federal investigation, and Brian Carter, a young officer trying to maintain his composure amid the tense standoff. Patrick Sullivan and Daniel Hayes stood 10 feet away, their eyes flickering between anger and panic after Torres' threat. "You have 10 minutes to release Colonel Reynolds, or I'll call in the SWAT team." Sarah stepped forward, her voice icy yet commanding. "You heard me loud and clear, Sullivan, Hayes. Let him go right now. This is no longer a choice." Sullivan laughed, the sound harsh and forced, his hands clenched into fists. "You think I'm going to let some guy in a black suit with a bunch of threatening papers intimidate me, Mitchell? We're doing everything by the book. He resisted me, and I have reports to prove it." He stepped forward, standing less than 3 feet from Sarah, his eyes blazing. Torres interjected, his voice deep but sharp as a knife. "Your report means nothing when the video out there shows he's innocent. Over 300,000 people have seen it. You think the FBI doesn't have a copy? I'm not here to play lawyer with you, Sullivan. I'm here to reclaim federal property." Hayes stepped back, rubbing his face, his voice trembling. "Federal assets? Are you serious? We don't even know who he is. We're just doing our job." Sarah turned to Hayes, her gaze sharp as ice. "Your work? You guys captured an Army colonel, a Pentagon advisor, without even checking his identity. Now he's a living piece of evidence in the investigation that the FBI and the Department of Defense have been pursuing for months. Not only are you wrong, but you've also turned yourselves into criminals." Sullivan clenched his fists and stepped closer to Torres, standing less than 2 feet away. "Are you trying to scare me, Torres? I'm not afraid of the FBI. This is my turf, and I won't let anyone go until I decide to." Torres smiled coldly, refusing to back down. "Your station? In 15 minutes, when my special forces arrive, it will belong to the federal government. Want to test that?" He pulled his phone from his jacket pocket, his finger gliding across the screen as if ready to dial. The atmosphere in the station was tense, like a tightly wound string, as if even a tiny spark could set everything off. Carter stood behind Sarah, his heart pounding, but he didn't take his eyes off Torres. He knew this agent wasn't messing around, and he also knew Sullivan was playing a dangerous game. Sarah turned to Sullivan, her voice low but filled with menace. "Stop it, Sullivan. Do you want to drag this whole department down with you? Let Marcus go, or I'll personally report you to Chief Carver. You choose." Sullivan stepped back, his eyes wavering. He turned to Hayes, who was now slumped in the chair, hands clutching his head. "What do you think, Hayes? What should we do?" Hayes looked up, his voice trembling. "Let him go, Sullivan. I don't want to get involved with the FBI or the Pentagon. If you want to dig your own grave, do it yourself. Don't drag me into it." Sullivan clenched his fist, but this time he didn't respond. The shouts from the crowd outside, "Justice for Colonel Hawk," pierced through the glass, a stark reminder that he was no longer in control of the situation. He turned to look at Torres, then Sarah, his gaze filled with rage but tinged with a hint of fear. "Fine," he growled, "but I won't forget this, Mitchell." Sarah nodded at Torres. "Take him away. I'll handle the rest." Torres walked toward the cell, 40 feet away from the main area, with Sarah and Carter following behind. As they opened the door, Marcus stood up, his tall frame filling the small space. He looked at Torres and gave a slight nod. "Agent Torres, I guess you arrived earlier than I expected." Torres smiled softly. "We don't keep our assets locked up for long, Colonel. Let's go. The community out there is waiting for you." Marcus stepped out of the cell, his gaze sweeping across the hallway. He saw Sullivan and Hayes standing there, Sullivan with a face flushed with anger, Hayes looking dazed. He didn't say a word, just gave Sarah a meaningful nod, a silent thank you. Outside, the crowd erupted in cheers as Marcus stepped out the front door, standing next to Torres and Sarah. Henry Brooks hugged Diane Miller tightly, his voice choked with emotion. "We did it." Jamal Carter saluted like a soldier, shouting, "Colonel Hawk is free." But inside the station, Sullivan turned his back and slammed his fist into the wall, leaving a small crack in the surface of the brick. "This isn't over," he muttered, his voice dripping with hatred. Hayes sat silently, his eyes vacant, as if he had just lost everything. Marcus stood before the crowd, taking a deep breath of the Tampa night air. He knew this fight was not just about him, but about a greater justice. And he also knew that inside that police station, the internal storm had only just begun. The night in Tampa, Florida, was now filled with the triumphant cheers of a crowd of over 200 people in front of the Tampa police station. The streetlights on North Morgan Street illuminated the beaming faces of Henry Brooks, Diane Miller, and Jamal Carter as they watched Colonel Marcus Hawk. Reynolds stepped out of the main entrance, standing alongside Agent David Torres and Lieutenant Sarah Mitchell. The applause roared like thunder, drowning out the cold wind blowing in from Tampa Bay a mile away. But inside the station, the atmosphere was anything but joyful. It was a heated internal battle escalating to a breaking point. Patrick Sullivan stood in the main area, 20 feet away from a registration desk, his fists clenched tight after punching the wall, leaving a small crack. He watched Marcus walk away through the glass, his eyes filled with hatred. Daniel Hayes slumped in his chair, cradling his head, whispering, "We're done for, Sullivan. The FBI, the Pentagon, they've dragged me into this mess." Sullivan turned back, his voice growling. "Shut up, Hayes. We haven't lost yet. I'll rewrite the report. We have the right to defend ourselves. They can't prove anything." But his voice trembled, no longer carrying the confidence it once had. The cheers from outside, "Justice for Colonel Hawk," felt like a knife cutting into his pride. Sarah Mitchell stood near the registration desk, her sharp gaze sweeping over Sullivan and Hayes. She had just witnessed Torres take Marcus outside, and now she knew she had to act to control the fallout. "Do you guys still not get it?" she said, her tone cold yet resolute. "This isn't just a reporting issue anymore. The FBI is involved, and they have video, Marcus's testimony, and even a warrant from CENTCOM. You've lost." Sullivan stepped forward, standing less than 3 feet from Sarah, his eyes blazing. "Are you siding with him, Mitchell? You're betraying me for some guy in a suit and that kid Carter?" Sarah stood her ground, her voice as solid as steel. "I'm not betraying anyone. I stand for the truth. You've got the wrong person, and now all of Tampa, the whole country, is watching us. If you want to save yourself, you better come clean, Sullivan." Before Sullivan could respond, a heavy footstep echoed from the hallway behind, about 40 feet away from the main area. Everyone turned around, and Chief of Police James Carver strode in, his face flushed with anger. He was around 55 years old, with salt and pepper hair and a tall, imposing figure reminiscent of a former football player. His uniform was crisp, but his eyes were like a brewing storm. "What the hell is going on here?" he bellowed, his voice resonating throughout the precinct. Carter, standing next to Sarah, swallowed hard, but Sarah stepped forward, her voice steady. "Mr. Carver, we have a serious problem. Sullivan and Hayes have taken Colonel Marcus Reynolds, a Pentagon advisor, this morning. He's been working undercover for federal investigation by the Department of Defense and the FBI. The FBI just pulled him out, and a crowd of over 200 people is demanding justice. Carver turned to Sullivan, his eyes blazing with fury. Army Colonel? Federation? Have you all lost your minds? Who gave you the right to do this? Sullivan tried to maintain a tough exterior, his voice tense. We're following the law, boss. He resisted when we tried to check him for the report. Carver stepped forward, standing less than 2 feet away from Sullivan, his voice low but filled with menace. By the book, the video out there shows he wasn't resisting. Hundreds of thousands have seen it. You think I'm stupid, Sullivan? You just dragged this whole department into a national scandal. Hayes jumped up, his voice trembling. I don't know who he is, sir. Sullivan is leading this case. I'm just following orders. Sullivan turned to Hayes, his eyes blazing. Are you really blaming me? You were there too, Hayes. Don't be such a coward. Carver raised his hand, signaling for silence, his voice slicing through the air like a knife. Enough! Both of you, shut up. I just got off the phone with Major General Richard Evans at CENTCOM, and he's furious about this. The FBI is sending people to investigate, and you two are the main targets. I want a full report from both of you on every detail. Right now. Sarah stepped in, her voice low but firm. Boss, I recommend we suspend Sullivan and Hayes immediately, pending an investigation. We need to contain the damage before the feds take full control. Carver turned to Sarah, his gaze softening a bit. All right, Mitchell, I'm putting you in charge of this. Get them out of here. I don't want to see their faces until further notice. Sullivan clenched his fist and stepped closer to Carver, his voice growling. Suspend me? You can't do that to me. I've been here for 15 years. I have rights. Carver turned back, his eyes like lightning. Your authority ends when you wrongfully arrest someone and put this entire department at risk of federal oversight. Get out, Sullivan, right now, or I'll have someone drag you out. The atmosphere in the station was tense, like a tightly wound string, as if a single punch could set everything off. Sullivan stood there, breathing heavily, his gaze wavering between anger and defeat. Finally, he turned his back and stepped out of the main area, each footfall heavy, as if carrying the weight of his own collapse. Hayes quietly followed, his head bowed, too afraid to look at anyone. Sarah turned to Carter, her voice dropping to a whisper. You did really well, Carter, but this isn't over yet. We need to get ready for what's coming next. Carter nodded, his gaze steady even though his hands trembled. I know, sir, but at least Marcus is out there, and that's what matters most. Outside, Marcus stood among the crowd, listening to their cheers and feeling their energy. He glanced through the glass, seeing Sullivan's figure leaving, and he knew the confrontation at the station had just reached its peak. But he also understood that this was only the beginning of a much larger battle. He whispered to himself, they haven't seen anything yet. Inside the station, Carver stood alone, gazing out at the crowd through the window. He took a deep breath, feeling the heavy weight of responsibility on his shoulders. He knew this police department would never be the same again, and he had to confront the fallout left by Sullivan and Hayes. Inside the Tampa police station, the atmosphere remained heavy even as the angry footsteps of Patrick Sullivan and Daniel Hayes faded away. Police Chief James Carver stood near the front window, about 50 feet from the reception desk, his sorrowful gaze fixed on the crowd of over 200 people still cheering outside. The streetlights on North Morgan Street illuminated his face, accentuating the deeper wrinkles formed after a tumultuous day. The chant of justice for Colonel Hawk, from Diane Miller, Henry Brooks, and Jamal Carter echoed through glass, a stark reminder that this battle was not just confined to the station, but was spreading throughout Tampa. Sarah Mitchell stepped closer to Carver, her voice low but steady. Sir, I'll start the internal investigation tonight. Sullivan and Hayes can't return until we sort everything out. The FBI will want all the reports. Carver nodded, not turning back, his voice hoarse. Do it, Mitchell. I trust you, but I want you to understand this isn't just about the two of them. If the feds dig deeper, they'll uncover much more. We have to be ready. Sarah frowned, her gaze sharp. What do you mean, boss? Is there more to it? Carver turned back, his gaze heavy. In the 15 years I've been here, I've seen a lot of things covered up, little incidents, mistakes. If the FBI digs us up, the whole department will shake. I need you to help me keep it standing strong. Sarah nodded, her hands clenched tightly. I'll do my best, boss. But we need to make real changes if we don't want to lose everything. Brian Carter, standing 10 feet away, spoke up, his voice hesitant yet firm. Sir, if I may, I believe Marcus Reynolds doesn't just want justice for himself. He wants something better for Tampa. Maybe we should consider working with him. Carver looked at Carter, his gaze softening a bit. You're right, Carter, but now isn't the time. First, we need to survive this storm. Outside, Marcus stood among the crowd, his gaze sweeping over the beaming faces of Henry, Diane, and Jamal. He raised his hand in a military salute, his deep voice resonating. Thank you all. This isn't just my victory, it's ours. The applause thundered once more, but Marcus knew the real battle was just beginning. Inside the station, Sarah turned back to the office, with Carter following closely behind. She whispered to him, Get ready, Carter. Tomorrow is going to be a long day. Carver stood alone, gazing out at the crowd slowly dispersing under the moonlight. He took a deep breath, feeling the cool Tampa night air through the crack in the door. He knew that tomorrow morning, when the sun rose, Tampa would never be the same, and he would have to face it, no matter the cost. Marcus walked away from the station, his gaze fixed on the shimmering Tampa Bay in the distance. He whispered, This is just a beginning. The dawn was breaking, bringing with it new hopes and challenges. The night in Tampa, Florida, seemed to shine brighter as Colonel Marcus Hawk Reynolds stepped out of the Tampa police station on North Morgan Street. The flickering streetlights illuminated his face, highlighting his sharp eyes and a subtle, meaningful smile. A crowd of over 200 people stood 50 feet from the main entrance, erupting in cheers and applause that thundered louder than the chilly winds from Tampa Bay a mile away. Henry Brooks held up a sign reading Justice for Colonel Hawk. Diane Miller shouted through a megaphone, We did it. And Jamal Carter saluted, his voice choked with emotion, Colonel Hawk is free. Marcus stood there, taking a deep breath of the cool night air, infused with the salty scent of the sea and a hint of greenery from a nearby park. After hours locked away in an 8-foot by 10-foot cell, this freedom was more than just escaping the handcuffs. It was a triumph of truth. He gazed out at the crowd of unfamiliar yet familiar faces, people who had never met him but had stood up for him. Agent David Torres stood beside him, gently patting his shoulder. Congratulations, Colonel, Torres said, his voice deep yet sincere. We'll take care of the rest. But I think you have a few words you want to share with them. Marcus nodded, his gaze sweeping over Lieutenant Sarah Mitchell standing across from him, her eyes resolute yet filled with respect. Thank you, Mitchell, he said, his voice steady and deep. You did the right thing. Sarah smiled softly and nodded. This is something I have to do, Colonel. But be careful, we're not done yet. Marcus stepped forward into the crowd, raising his hand for silence. The noise gradually faded, leaving only the sound of the wind blowing and the distant waves from the bay. He looked at Henry, Diane, Jamal, and dozens of others and began to speak, his voice resonating powerfully like when he commanded in Baghdad. Thank you all, he started, his gaze sweeping over each face. Today, I'm not just free because of you, but justice has triumphed because of you. This isn't just my story. It's all of ours, those of us who want a better, fairer system. The crowd erupted in applause once more, but Marcus raised his hand, his voice dropping, filled with emotion. I was arrested this morning not because I did anything wrong, but because of the color of my skin, because of the biases of a few people in this system. But you have given me and all those who have been treated unfairly a voice, and I promise you that voice will not stop here. Henry Brooks stepped forward, embracing Marcus tightly, his voice choked with emotion. You make us proud, Marcus. You're the best soldier I've ever met. Marcus patted Henry on the shoulder, smiling. Thank you, Henry. But you and everyone here are the real heroes today. Diane Miller held the microphone, her voice ringing out. We will not stop. Justice for Marcus is the first step. Now we need to change all of Tampa. The crowd cheered, applause erupted, and Marcus felt that collective strength like a fire spreading. Inside the station, Police Chief James Carver stood near the window, about 50 feet from the front desk, gazing out at the scene outside with a complicated expression. Sarah Mitchell approached, her voice low. "Boss, what do we do next?" "The FBI is coming back, and Sullivan and Hayes won't back down." Carver turned back, his voice hoarse. "I know, Mitchell. I just suspended them, but this is bigger than those two. We need to clean up our house before the feds come in and do it for us." Sarah nodded, her gaze resolute. "I'll start the internal investigation tonight, but I think we should team up with Marcus. He might help us make a difference." Carver frowned but didn't object. "Go ahead. I'll talk to him when the time is right. For now, just let him enjoy this victory." Outside, Marcus was led by the crowd to Curtis Hickson Park, a mile away from the police station, where the space was more open and airy. He stood on the grass, gazing at the shimmering Tampa Bay under moonlight, feeling a surge of hope rising within him. Jamal Carter stepped forward, his voice filled with pride. "Colonel, you remind us of the days in Iraq when we always led the way, always fighting for what's right." Marcus smiled and patted Jamal on the shoulder. "You too, Sergeant. Today we fought together and we won." But deep down, Marcus knew this was just the beginning. He looked toward the police station, where the light still flickered, and whispered to himself, "Justice has started, but we have a long way to go." The crowd slowly dispersed, leaving Marcus with his thoughts under the night sky of Tampa. He felt the dawn of a bigger change approaching. Curtis Hickson Park in Tampa, Florida, is now bathed in silver moonlight, casting its glow on the lush green grass and the shimmering waters of Tampa Bay just half a mile away. Colonel Marcus Hawk Reynolds stands in the open space, a mile from the Tampa police station, surrounded by familiar faces. Henry Brooks, Diane Miller, Jamal Carter, and dozens of locals who have just left the protest. The victorious cheers have faded, giving way to a profound atmosphere, as if everyone is collectively absorbing the significance of this moment. A gentle night breeze sweeps through, carrying the scent of salt water and the breath of newfound freedom. Marcus looked at the small crowd of about 50 people and felt the quiet strength within them. He stepped closer to Henry Brooks, who was holding a now frayed sign that read, "Justice for Colonel Hawk," after a long day. "Aren't you tired, Henry?" Marcus asked, his voice warm. "You've been standing there for hours for me." Henry smiled, a smile full of wrinkles but bright. "Tired? Not a chance, Marcus. I once stood guard for 12 hours in Vietnam. This is a battle worth the fatigue. You're one of our soldiers, and we don't leave our comrades behind." He patted Marcus on the shoulder, his eyes shining with pride. Diane Miller stepped forward, holding the megaphone but now setting it down on the grass. "Marcus, you inspired us," she said, her voice steady like a commander's. "But you're right, this isn't just about you. We want to change Tampa, and the VFW will stand behind you every step of the way." Marcus nodded, his gaze sweeping over Diane and then to Jamal Carter, who was standing 10 feet away, his hand still raised in a military salute. "I'm not doing this alone," he said, his voice steady and deep. "You all have turned an injustice into a movement. Jamal, you fought alongside me in Iraq, and now we're fighting together here." Jamal stepped forward, his eyes blazing. "Colonel, I've never doubted you. In Baghdad, you led us through fire and bullets. Today, you're leading us through injustice. I will follow you to the end." He shook Marcus's hand, the grip as firm as a vow. A small crowd began to gather around Marcus, their eyes shining with hope. A young woman, about 30 years old, wearing a Tampa Bay Rays t-shirt, stepped forward. "I'm Maria Lopez," she introduced herself, her voice hesitant yet sincere. "I don't know you, but I saw the video and came here. My son, he's 12 years old, and he asked me why the police do this to good people. I want to grow up in a fairer Tampa." Marcus looked at Maria, his gaze softening. "Thank you, Maria, for your son, and for all the kids here. We will do this. I promise." A gentle applause echoed, not loud like before, but profound like a promise. Marcus raised his hand, his voice ringing out strong. "Today is a victory for justice, but it doesn't stop here. I will work with the Department of Defense, with the FBI, and with all of you to ensure that what happened to me never happens again." We will build a Tampa where everyone is treated fairly, regardless of skin color or background. The crowd erupted in cheers, the sound of applause rising, this time louder, like a flame of hope being ignited. Diane raised her hand, her voice cutting through the wind. The VFW will launch a community oversight group to work with police. Who wants to join? Dozens of hands shot up, from Henry, Jamal, to Maria and others. Marcus smiled. This was what he had been hoping for. Not just victory, but action. He turned to Torres, who was standing about 20 feet away, his gaze discreetly observing. Agent Torres, you see this? This is real power. Is the FBI ready to collaborate with them? Torres nodded, his voice low. We're not just collaborating, we need them. The investigation will be stronger with this community. You've done what we couldn't, Colonel. Marcus looked back at the crowd, feeling the heartbeat of hope in each person. He stepped closer to the riverbank at Curtis Hickson Park, gazing at the water shimmering under the moonlight. This is the beginning, he whispered to himself. A new Tampa is on the horizon. Meanwhile, at the police station, Sarah Mitchell sat in her office, 40 feet away from the main area, her fingers flying over the keyboard as she began an internal investigation. Brian Carter stood beside her, handing her a cup of coffee. "Do you think we can pull this off, Lieutenant?" he asked, his voice tinged with a hint of worry. Sarah looked up, her gaze resolute. "We can do this, Carter. Marcus has paved the way. Now it's our turn to follow." Under the moonlight, a flame of hope begins to spread from Curtis Hickson Park, promising a new future for Tampa. Under the silver moonlight at Curtis Hickson Park in Tampa, Florida, the atmosphere gradually fell silent as a small crowd of about 50 people began to disperse, leaving Colonel Marcus Hawk Reynolds standing near the banks of the Hillsborough River, less than half a mile from Tampa Bay. The shimmering water reflected the soft light, like a mirror showcasing the hard-fought victory just achieved. A gentle night breeze swept through, carrying the scent of salt water and the breath of fresh hope. Marcus watched the fading silhouettes of Henry Brooks, Diane Miller, Jamal Carter, and Maria Lopez, feeling the weight of responsibility now resting squarely on his shoulders. This was not just his freedom. It was the beginning of something much greater. He turned to Agent David Torres, who stood about 20 feet away, maintaining the calm demeanor of an FBI agent. "Torres," Marcus called, his voice steady and low. "You said the investigation will continue. What do we need from Tampa to make this happen?" Torres stepped forward, his gaze sharp yet sincere. "We need witnesses, evidence, and cooperation from this community. The video of your arrest has already garnered over 400,000 views, which is a great start. But we need more. Internal reports, testimony from people like you and Mitchell. You sparked this movement, Colonel. Now lead it." Marcus nodded, his gaze fixed on the Tampa police station a mile away, where light still flickered through the windows. "I'll do it, but I don't want to just be a witness. I want Tampa to be a model for change. I'll work with the VFW, with the community, and if necessary, with the police department too." Torres smiled gently and patted Marcus on the shoulder. "I knew you'd say that. The FBI will contact us. We need you in Washington next week to report. But for now, take a break. You deserve it." Marcus shook Torres' hand, the grip firm like a pact. "Thank you, Agent. I'll be ready." Torres turned away, walking toward his car parked 100 feet away, leaving Marcus lost in his thoughts. Jamal Carter stepped forward, his brisk walk that of a seasoned sergeant. "Colonel, I just spoke with a few folks from MacDill," he said, his voice brimming with excitement. "They want to support what could be a joint training program with the local police to prevent incidents like today. What do you think?" Marcus turned to Jamal, his eyes lighting up. "That's a great idea, Sergeant. We'll start from their training, educating, and supervising. I want you to reach out to CENTCOM and see what they can do. This is an opportunity for military and the community to transform Tampa together." Jamal nodded, his eyes blazing with determination. "I'll get right on it, Colonel. This isn't just about justice. It's about the future." He saluted sharply, then walked away, his phone already in hand to kick off the plan. Meanwhile, at the Tampa police station, Lieutenant Sarah Mitchell sat in her office, 40 feet away from the main area, the light from her computer screen casting a glow on her face. Brian Carter stood beside her, holding a freshly printed stack of documents. "Here's a preliminary report on Sullivan and Hayes," he said, his voice steady. "I found a few old cases they were involved in that aren't serious like this one, but enough to catch the FBI's attention." Sarah looked up, her gaze sharp. "All right, Carter. Send it to Agent Torres tomorrow morning. We need to clean up our house before the feds dig any deeper." She paused, her voice dropping. "But I want you to think bigger. What if Marcus cooperates with us? What do you think about a reform program? Retraining officers, community oversight?" Carter smiled, his eyes lighting up. "I think that's the only way, Lieutenant. Marcus has influence, and if he leads, we can really make a difference." Sarah nodded, her fingers flying over the keyboard. "I'll pitch it to Carver tomorrow morning. This isn't just about surviving the storm. It's about rebuilding from the ashes." Outside Curtis Hickson Park, Marcus stood alone, gazing at the shimmering Tampa Bay under the moonlight. He reflected on what had happened during the wrongful arrest in Channelside, the hours spent in a holding cell, and the power of the crowd that had set him free. He recalled his father's words from when he was a child. "Hawk, justice doesn't come on its own. You have to fight for it." Today he had fought, and all of Tampa had fought alongside him. He pulled out his phone and called his mom, Evelyn Reynolds, who was waiting for him at home 5 miles away. "Mom," he said when she picked up, his voice warm. "I'm okay. I'll be home tonight. Do you still have that barbecue ribs waiting for me?" Evelyn laughed through the phone, her voice choked with emotion. "Of course, my son. I've been watching the news all day, and it's making me worry sick. But I'm so proud of you, Hawk." Marcus smiled, his eyes softening. "Thank you, Mom. I'll tell you everything when I get back. I'll see you soon." He hung up, tucked his phone into his pocket, and gazed up at the starry night sky over Tampa. He walked on, each step as steady as when he led troops in Baghdad. He knew tomorrow would bring new challenges, a meeting with the FBI, a reform plan with the community, and a confrontation with what remained in the police department. But this time, he wasn't alone. He had Henry, Diane, Jamal, Maria, Sarah, Carter, and even Tampa standing behind him. Under the moonlight, Marcus whispered to himself, "We've won this battle, but the war is still ahead, and I'm ready." Curtis Hickson Park has returned to tranquility, with only the sound of waves lapping from Tampa Bay. But in that silence, a flame of renewal has been ignited, promising a new dawn for the city. 6 months have passed since that fateful night at the Tampa police station, when Colonel Marcus Hawk Reynolds stepped out of the holding cell under the flickering streetlights on North Morgan Street. Tampa, Florida, now carries a different hue. It's no longer just a city known for its sparkling bay or the Tampa Bay Lightning hockey team, but a place where a movement for justice has taken root. The morning sun filters through the trees in Curtis Hickson Park, just a mile from the police station, where Marcus stands alone, gazing at the gentle flow of the Hillsborough River. He wears a simple white shirt with the sleeves rolled up, yet his presence still exudes the gravitas of a soldier who has led through the fires of battle. 6 months ago, he was at the center of a storm, wrongfully caught up in a mess at Channelside, locked away in an 8-foot by 10-foot cell, and freed by the strength of over 200 Tampa residents, along with the intervention of the FBI. Now, he is the flame igniting a journey of renewal. Marcus takes a deep breath of the cool morning air, the scent of salt from Tampa Bay half a mile away wafting through, and recalls the promise he made to the crowd under the moonlight. We will build a fairer Tampa. Today, he is turning that promise into reality. 5 miles away, at his mother Evelyn Reynolds' house in West Tampa, the mouth-watering smell of grilled ribs wafted from the kitchen. Evelyn, a 65-year-old woman with neatly tied silver hair, was preparing breakfast for Marcus before he headed off to Washington, D.C. Son. She called, her voice warm but tinged with worry. "Are you sure you're okay? You've been running back and forth from Tampa to D.C. for 6 months now, and I just want you to take a little break." Marcus walked into the kitchen, smiling when he saw his mom. "I'm okay, Mom. I have to do this not just for myself, but for everyone who stood up for me." He sat down at the table, holding a cup of coffee his mom poured, his gaze softening. "Today I'm flying to D.C. to meet with the FBI and the Department of Defense. They want the final report on the investigation in Tampa." Evelyn placed a plate of grilled ribs in front of him, Her voice choked with emotion. "I'm so proud of you, Hawk. But I'm also scared that you're going up against powerful people. They won't let you change things easily." Marcus held his mother's hand, his voice deep yet steady. "Mom, don't worry. I've got all of Tampa behind me, Henry, Diane, Jamal, and even people in the police department like Sarah Mitchell. We're not alone." At the Tampa Police Department, Lieutenant Sarah Mitchell sat in her office, 40 feet away from the main area, typing quickly on her computer. For the past 6 months, she had been leading a fierce internal investigation with the support of Brian Carter. Patrick Sullivan and Daniel Hayes had been permanently suspended after the FBI uncovered evidence of their past abuses of power, not just in Marcus's case, but in dozens of other incidents that had been covered up over the last 15 years. Sarah looked up as Carter walked in, holding a thick stack of documents. "Carter," she said, her voice sharp, "is this the final report for the FBI?" Carter nodded and set the stack of documents down on the table. "That's right, Lieutenant. I just added statements from a few other officers about what Sullivan and Hayes had done. Chief Carver has approved it." Sarah smiled softly, her gaze steady. "Good. Marcus will bring it to D.C. today. But you know, Carter, this isn't just the end of the investigation. We're starting a reform program. I just met with Carver, and he agreed to collaborate with Marcus and the community." Carter sat down, his eyes lighting up. "Really? So we're going to work with him? Retraining the officers, overseeing the community like he said?" Sarah nodded, lightly tapping her fingers on the table. "That's right. Marcus has reached out to the VFW and CENTCOM. They're planning a joint program with the military, police, and community members working together to prevent incidents like that day. I want you to be involved. You're the person I trust the most here." Carter smiled, his voice filled with pride. "I'm ready, Lieutenant. Marcus has changed everything I want to be a part of." From miles away, at MacDill Air Force Base, Sergeant Jamal Carter stood in the briefing room with a few teammates, his eyes blazing as he laid out Marcus's plan. "Colonel Hawk wants us to support Tampa," he said, pointing at the map on the wall. "We'll train local police on de-escalation techniques, work with the VFW to monitor the community. CENTCOM has agreed we can start next week." Lisa Torres, the female soldier who went to police station with Jamal 6 months ago, nodded. "That's a great idea. Colonel Hawk not only saved us in Iraq, he's saving Tampa right now." Jamal clapped his hands, his voice strong. "That's right. This is how we honor him and build a better city." Back at Curtis Hickson Park, Marcus stood gazing at the river, his hands stuffed in his pockets. He reflected on the wrongful arrest, the crowd's chants, and the support from Sarah, Carter, and Jamal. For the past 6 months, he had been working tirelessly, meeting with the FBI in Washington, coordinating with the VFW in Tampa, and planning with CENTCOM. But today, he felt a turning point, a chance to make Tampa a model for justice. He heard the sound of a car stopping about 100 feet away. Agent David Torres stepped out, walking with a commanding presence. "Colonel," Torres called, his voice deep, "the car is here to pick you up. The flight to D.C. will take off in 2 hours. The FBI and the Department of Defense are waiting." Marcus turned back, nodding. "Thank you, Torres. I'm ready." He walked toward the car, his gaze steady. The journey starting from here wasn't just a report. It was a promise to Tampa and all of America. The black SUV glided smoothly down the I-95 highway, carrying Colonel Marcus Hawk, Reynolds, from Tampa International Airport to Washington, D.C. Over 800 miles away, inside the vehicle, Marcus sat in the back seat, his gaze fixed out the window as the Virginia fields rolled by in the midday sun. 6 months ago, he was an innocent man trapped in an 8-foot by 10-foot cell at the Tampa police station. Now, he was on a mission to change not just Tampa, but the entire American law enforcement system. Agent David Torres sat in the front seat, his fingers gliding over the iPad, his voice steady and low. "Colonel, we'll be meeting with Major General Richard Evans from CENTCOM and a team from the FBI at the Pentagon in 2 hours. They want to hear from you directly." Marcus nodded, his hand lightly gripping the stack of documents on his lap, the final report from Tampa, prepared by Sarah Mitchell and Brian Carter, along with his notes on the reform plan. "I'm ready, Torres. But I'm not just here to report. I want them to see Tampa as the beginning of a much bigger change. Torres smiled softly, his gaze discreet. I knew you would say that. General Evans is tough, but he respects you after what you did in Baghdad. The FBI also wants to expedite their investigation into your case as a significant leverage. The car came to a stop in front of the Pentagon, the massive building in Arlington, Virginia. About 3 miles from downtown D.C., Marcus stepped out, straightened his blazer, and took in the crisp autumn air of the North. He had been here dozens of times as a strategic advisor, but today was different. Today, he wasn't just a colonel, but the voice of hundreds of people back in Tampa. In the third-floor conference room, 200 feet from the main entrance, Marcus walked in and saw Major General Richard Evans sitting at the head of the table, his white hair and sharp gaze cutting through the air. Surrounding him were 3 FBI agents, including a woman in her 40s with neatly tied blonde hair, introducing herself as Special Agent in Charge Karen Hayes, along with 2 senior officers from the Department of Defense. Evans stood up, shook Marcus's hand, his deep voice resonating. "Colonel Reynolds, good to see you again. I've heard you've stirred things up in Tampa. Now tell me what happened." Marcus sat down, placing a stack of documents on the table. His gaze locked onto Evans. "General, 6 months ago, I was wrongfully arrested by 2 Tampa police officers, Patrick Sullivan and Daniel Hayes, at Channelside. They had no reason, just their biases. I was handcuffed and locked up in the station, but the Tampa community, over 200 strong, from VFW to MacDill, stood up demanding justice. The FBI intervened, and I was released. But that wasn't the end." Karen Hayes leaned in, her voice sharp. "We've investigated Sullivan and Hayes. They were fired after evidence of misconduct was found over a decade. But you say this is just the beginning. What do you mean?" Marcus took a deep breath, his voice deep yet powerful. "What I'm saying is that my case isn't just a mistake. It's a symptom of a broken system. I've been working undercover for the Department of Defense to investigate discrimination within local police. And Tampa is living proof. The video of the arrest is over 1 million views, with people outraged, but they also want change. I propose a reform program, training police alongside the military, community oversight with the VFW, and education in schools to tackle bias at its roots." Evans frowned, lightly tapping his fingers on the table. "That's a big plan, Reynolds. You think it'll work in Tampa. But what about the rest of the country? We can't send troops to every police station." Marcus leaned in, his gaze steady. "We don't need to do that, General. Tampa will be the model if we succeed. Other cities will follow. I've seen the strength of the community. There are Henry Brooks, Diane Miller, Jamal Carter, and even Lieutenant Sarah Mitchell from the police department. They're ready to work with us. CENTCOM can support training. The FBI can oversee the investigation, and I'll lead from the ground." Karen Hayes nodded, her eyes lighting up. "I love this idea. If we turn Tampa into a success story, it will put pressure on the other departments. But do you have concrete evidence that this plan has already started?" Marcus opened the document, his deep voice filled with confidence. "It's begun. Over the past 6 months, the VFW in Tampa has formed a 20-member community oversight group, including veterans and civilians like Maria Lopez. CENTCOM has started experimental training with Tampa police, led by Jamal Carter from MacDill. Sarah Mitchell and Brian Carter are reforming the department internally. They fired 5 officers with history of misconduct, and Chief Carver has agreed to cooperate. Here are the numbers. 30% of the officers who completed the stress reduction training have shown improvement, and complaints from the public have dropped by 15% in the last 3 months." Evans leaned back in his chair, his gaze softening. "You've impressed me, Reynolds. I used to think you were only good on the battlefield, but now I see you're just as skilled here. But you know, there will be pushback. Not everyone is ready for change." Marcus smiled softly, his voice warm and deep. "I know, sir. I faced resistance in Baghdad, and I came through it. This is just another battlefield. I'm not doing this for fame. I'm doing it for people like Maria Lopez, who want their sons to grow up in a fair Tampa." Karen Hayes tapped her pen on the table, her voice steady. "I'm on board. The FBI will provide documentation and legal support. If Tampa succeeds, we'll replicate this model in Atlanta, Chicago, wherever it's needed. Evans nodded, stood up, and shook Marcus's hand once more. All right, Colonel. You have CENTCOM's backing. Don't let me down. Marcus stood up, the handshake firm like a promise. I won't, sir. Thank you. As he left the conference room and stepped into the long 100-foot hallway of the Pentagon, Marcus felt the weight of the moment. He had faced power, and he had convinced them, but he knew that winning here was just a first step. Truly changing Tampa would be the biggest challenge. He whispered to himself, "This is for all of you back in Tampa." Under the D.C. sun, Marcus stepped outside, his gaze fixed ahead, ready for the next journey. Late afternoon in Tampa, Florida, bathed in soft golden sunlight, cast a warm glow over the Tampa Police Department on North Morgan Street. 6 months after the night Marcus Hawk Reynolds was released from a cramped 8-foot by 10-foot cell, the city began to change not just in the way its people viewed it, but in the concrete actions unfolding before them. Marcus stepped out of the black SUV that had just driven him from Tampa International Airport 7 miles away after his trip to Washington, D.C. He wore a white shirt and jeans, yet his presence still radiated the authority of an Army colonel who had led men to the fire battle. Agent David Torres had left after meeting at the Pentagon, but Marcus's promise to Major General Richard Evans and Chief Agent Karen Hayes still echoed within him, to transform Tampa into a beacon of justice. Marcus walked into the police station, the same place where he had been wrongfully detained. But this time he wasn't a victim. He was a guide. Lieutenant Sarah Mitchell had invited him to speak to a group of 25 new officers who had just completed their basic training, ready to step into the profession. Sarah stood in the main area, about 20 feet away from front desk, her eyes lighting up when she saw Marcus. "Colonel," she greeted, her tone warm yet professional. "Thank you for coming. These folks need to hear from you. They are the future of the department." Marcus nodded and shook Sarah's hand. "Thank you, Mitchell. If we want to make a change, we have to start with them." He looked around. The atmosphere in the station was now much different than it had been 6 months ago, less tense. More open, though traces of the past under Patrick Sullivan and Daniel Hayes still lingered. Sarah led him to the training room, about 50 feet away from the main area, a spacious room with neatly arranged tables and chairs and a whiteboard on the wall. 25 young officers sat there, ranging in age from 20 to 30, their eyes a mix of curiosity and excitement. Brian Carter stood in the corner of the room, holding a clipboard, smiling when he saw Marcus. "Colonel," Carter said, his voice filled with pride, "they've heard about you, but hearing it directly will be something else." Marcus stepped forward, his gaze sweeping over each face. He stood tall, no need for a microphone, his deep voice resonating like when he commanded in Baghdad. "Hello, everyone," he began, his eyes steady. "I'm Colonel Marcus Reynolds, United States Army, having served in Iraq and Afghanistan, now a consultant at the Pentagon. But 6 months ago, I was wrongfully detained right in the station, not for any crime, but because of the biases of 2 officers who once held positions just like yours." The room fell silent, all eyes fixed on Marcus. He continued, his voice deep yet filled with emotion. "I'm not here to blame anyone. I'm here to tell you that justice isn't just about handcuffs or a law book. Justice is how you treat everyone out there, no matter who they are, what they look like, or where they come from. I was handcuffed in Channelside, just a mile away, but over 200 people from Tampa veterans, service members, everyday folks stood up for me. They taught me that true justice starts in the community, and you all are the bridge to that community." A young officer, about 22 years old, with short brown hair, raises her hand. The name tag reads Sarah Johnson. She stands up, her voice hesitant yet sincere. "Sir, I'm Sarah Johnson. I joined this profession because I want to help others. But after your incident, I'm afraid I'll make mistakes and that I won't be good enough. Do you have any advice for me?" Marcus smiled, his gaze softening. "Sarah, thank you for that question. I used to be terrified in Baghdad, afraid that a mistake would cost my teammates dearly. But I learned that fear isn't the issue. It's what you do with it that matters. Listen to the community, learn from them, and always ask yourself, who am I helping today? If you can keep that in mind, you won't just be good enough, you'll be exceptional." Sarah Johnson sat down, her eyes lighting up, and a soft round of applause echoed from the other officers. Marcus continued, his voice growing stronger. Over the past 6 months, Tampa has transformed because we've worked together. The VFW has formed community oversight groups that patrol alongside you, reporting injustices. CENTCOM has trained you in stress reduction techniques. 30% of the officers who completed that training have seen a decrease in complaints from the public by 15%. This department has let go of people like Sullivan and Hayes, and Lieutenant Mitchell is building a new system. But you're the heart of it. You decide what Tampa will look like in 10, 20 years. Another officer, a man about 25 years old, raised his hand. Sir, I'm Mike Torres. What if we mess up? How do we fix it? Marcus stepped closer to Mike, his voice warm and deep. Mike, everyone makes mistakes. I've made my share on the battlefield, but I fix them by facing them head-on, learning, and doing better. If you mess up, own it, make it right, and don't let your ego get in the way. That's how we build trust with the people. The applause erupted again, this time louder, like a flame that had just been reignited. Marcus raised his hand, his voice reaching a peak of emotion. I don't want you to just be police officers. I want you to be true guardians of justice. Remember this first day, the day you chose to stand with the people, not against them. That's the strength of Tampa, and I believe you will carry it far. The whole room stood up, clapping enthusiastically, their eyes shining with newfound hope. Sarah Johnson stepped forward, shaking hands with Marcus, her voice choked with emotion. Thank you, Colonel. I won't forget this. Marcus patted her on the shoulder, smiling. I believe in you, Sarah. Sarah Mitchell stepped forward, her eyes filled with pride. Colonel, you just ignited a fire in them. This is what we need, a new generation ready to make a change. Marcus nodded, his gaze directed out the window where sunlight streamed in. They are the future, Mitchell, and I will be here to help them. As he left the room, the sound of applause echoed behind him. Marcus felt the spark he had ignited within him, a flame of hope, justice, and renewal. He whispered to himself, this is how we start over. The evening in Tampa, Florida, carried a cool breeze from Tampa Bay, about a mile from downtown. 6 months after Colonel Marcus Hawk, Reynolds was released from the Tampa Police Department. This city had transformed from a place of wrongful arrest into a symbol of renewal. In a small community center in West Tampa, 5 miles from the police station, Marcus stood in the middle of a crowded room, the light from hanging bulbs illuminating his face. He wore a dark blue shirt with the sleeves rolled up, his sharp gaze scanning over 50 representatives from the Veterans of Foreign Wars, VFW, service members from MacDill Air Force Base, civilians, and even police officers, all gathered to discuss the future of Tampa. Marcus stood next to a whiteboard, marker in hand, his steady voice resonating. Thank you all for being here, he began, his gaze sweeping over Henry Brooks, Diane Miller, Jamal Carter, Maria Lopez, and Lieutenant Sarah Mitchell, the ones who had stood by him since day one. 6 months ago, we stood outside the police station, demanding justice. Today, we are here to build it. I want you to hear what we've accomplished and what we will do next. Diane Miller, the president of VFW Tampa, stood up in the front row, her voice strong. Our community watch group has been active for 5 months with 25 members, ranging from veterans like Henry to civilians like Maria. We patrol alongside the police, documenting 15 potential incidents of tension, and help resolve them before they escalate. Complaints from residents have dropped by 20% in the Channelside area, which is proof that we're on the right track. A light applause echoed, and Marcus nodded, his eyes lighting up. Thank you, Diane. That's the strength of your community, not just overseeing, but also bridging connections. Jamal, why don't you talk about MacDill's role? Jamal Carter, a sergeant from MacDill Air Force Base just 4 miles away, stepped forward, standing tall in his civilian clothes. Colonel, CENTCOM has trained 50 Tampa police officers over the past 3 months in stress reduction techniques, community communication, and situation control. I led a team of 5 from MacDill, working in coordination with the police department. The results: 40% of the officers reported feeling more confident when handling stress, and 10 potential confrontations were resolved without the use of force. The applause erupted again, this time louder. Marcus patted Jamal on the shoulder, his voice warm and deep. "Well done, Sergeant. You're bringing battlefield experience to the streets of Tampa, just like I hoped you would." Sarah Mitchell stood up, holding a stack of reports, her gaze unwavering. "From a police department, we have fired 5 officers with a history of misconduct following the Sullivan and Hayes incident. Chief Carver has approved a reform program for 100 officers who have undergone retraining, which represents 35% of our force. Brian Carter is leading an internal oversight team, and we reduced complaints by 25% over the past 6 months. But more importantly, we've started working with the VFW and CENTCOM. This is the first time the police and the community are truly collaborating." Marcus nodded, his eyes filled with pride. "Mitchell, you and Carter have changed the organization from the inside, and that's the hardest part. Maria, why don't you talk about the education aspect?" Maria Lopez, the mother who once met Marcus at Curtis Hickson Park, stood up, her voice wavering yet sincere. "I work with Blake High School, just 2 miles away, to bring a justice education program into the classroom. We teach kids about their rights, how to interact with the police, and the history of Tampa, including your case, Colonel. 300 students have participated, and last week, my son told me, 'Mom, I want to grow up to be a person like Colonel Hawk.' I believe we are changing the future." The whole room erupted in applause, cheers ringing out like a fire that had just been ignited. Marcus stepped forward, shaking Maria's hand, his voice choked with emotion. "Thank you, Maria, for your son and all the kids here in Tampa. This is why we do this." Henry Brooks, a Vietnam War veteran, raised his hand, his voice rough yet strong. "Marcus, you've led us through the storm. But what about people like Sullivan? They won't just sit back. What do we do if they come back?" Marcus turned to Henry, his gaze unwavering. "Henry, they might come back, but this time we're stronger. The police department has Mitchell and Carter. The community has the VFW and the people, and we have CENTCOM with the FBI backing us. If they dare to try, we won't push back with force, but with truth and unity." The applause erupted once again, and Marcus raised his hands, his voice reaching a peak of emotion. 6 months ago, I was wrongfully arrested in Channelside, but today, Tampa stands as proof that justice is more than just words. We've reduced complaints, trained officers, and taught our kids their worth. This isn't just my victory, it's all of ours. I want you to promise me, we won't stop, no matter how tough it gets. Tampa will be a model for the entire country, and we can make it happen." The whole room stood up. The sound of applause thundered like a storm, and everyone's eyes sparkled with faith and hope. Diane stepped forward, embraced Marcus tightly, her voice choked with emotion. "You are our fire, Marcus. We will follow you to the end." Jamal clapped his hands and shouted, "Colonel Hawk leads the way." Sarah Mitchell and Brian Carter smiled from the corner of the room, their eyes filled with pride. Maria Lopez clenched her fists tightly, whispering to herself, "Thank you, Colonel." As the meeting wrapped up, Marcus stepped out of the community center, the moonlight shining on his face. He gazed out toward Tampa Bay, 2 miles away, feeling the power of collaboration, a force that not only freed him from his cell, but was transforming an entire city. He whispered to himself, "This is how we rebuild together." Under the moonlight, Marcus stood there, his gaze set on the future. He knew challenges lay ahead, but with this community, he believed they could overcome anything. The flame of innovation had spread, and it would never be extinguished. Early morning in Tampa, Florida, brings gentle sunlight streaming through the trees at Curtis Hickson Park, just a mile from the Tampa Police Department. 6 months after Marcus Hawk Reynolds was freed from his 8-foot by 10-foot cell, this city has not only changed the hearts of its locals, but has also become a focal point of national attention. Marcus stands on the grass near the Hillsborough River, coffee cup in hand, his gaze fixed on the sparkling Tampa Bay half a mile away. He has just returned from a short trip to Atlanta, where he met with community leaders eager to learn about Tampa's reform model. Over the past 6 months, he has been on the move from Tampa to Washington, D.C., and to other cities, carrying the torch of justice that he and the community have ignited. Today is a special day. Marcus received an invitation from Lieutenant Sarah Mitchell to attend an event at the West Tampa Community Center, just 5 miles away, for the official announcement of the reform program that has been expanded to 3 other cities: Atlanta, Charlotte, and New Orleans. He got into the car, a Jeep driven by Jamal Carter, who has become his right-hand man on projects with CENTCOM. "Colonel," Jamal said, his voice filled with excitement as the car rolled forward, "I just heard from MacDill that they want to expand training for the Atlanta police. You've achieved the impossible." Marcus smiled, his gaze drifting out the window. "It's not just me, Jamal. It's all of us. Tampa is proof that the community and the police can work together. I'm just the one holding the torch." At the West Tampa Community Center, the space was packed with over 100 representatives from the VFW, CENTCOM, the Tampa Police Department, and guests from Atlanta and Charlotte. Sarah Mitchell stood at the main podium, her eyes lighting up as she saw Marcus walk in. "Colonel Reynolds," she greeted, her voice warm, "we've been waiting for you. Today is a big day, not just for Tampa, but for the entire country." Marcus stepped up to the podium, his gaze sweeping over the crowd. Henry Brooks sat in the front row. Diane Miller stood beside him with a proud smile. Maria Lopez held her 12-year-old son, and Brian Carter was taking notes in the corner of a room. He took a deep breath, his deep voice resonating. "6 months ago, I stood here, promising you that Tampa would change. Today, I stand here to say that we're not just changing Tampa. We're inspiring the entire nation. Our reform program is training police, overseeing communities, and educating children, and it has been adopted by Atlanta, Charlotte, and New Orleans. This is proof that justice is not just words, it's action." The sound of applause echoed, soft yet warm. Sarah stepped forward, handing the microphone to Marcus, her voice strong. "Colonel, you should tell them what we've accomplished. The numbers don't lie." Marcus nodded, his eyes lighting up. "In Tampa, complaints to the police dropped by 25% in just 6 months thanks to 100 officers retrained by CENTCOM and community oversight from the VFW. 300 students at Blake High School learned about their rights, and 15 tense situations were resolved without any violence. Atlanta has just started training 50 officers based on our model, and complaints have already decreased by 10% in just 2 months. This isn't just about the numbers. It's about lives being changed." The crowd erupted in applause, and Diane Miller raised her hand, her voice resonating. "The VFW sent a representative to Charlotte last week because they want to set up a watchdog group like ours. Marcus, you've done what the government couldn't do, brought us together." Jamal Carter stood up, his eyes blazing. "CENTCOM is expanding the MacDill program to train police in New Orleans next month. Colonel Hawk, you're not just saving Tampa, you're saving the whole country." Cheers erupted, but before Marcus could respond, a middle-aged man from the back row stepped forward. Patrick Sullivan, wearing a worn-out coat, his eyes filled with hatred. The crowd fell silent, tension thick in the air. "Reynolds," Sullivan spat, standing 10 feet away from Marcus. "You think you're a hero? You ruined my life, and Hayes' 15 years of my career gone. Because of you, this isn't justice, it's revenge." Marcus looked at Sullivan, his gaze calm yet resolute. "Sullivan, I'm not destroying anything. You did that yourself when you arrested me without reason, when you abused your power over dozens of others. Justice isn't about revenge. It's about fixing what's wrong. You had a chance to change, but you turned it down." Sullivan clenched his fists, his voice trembling. "You don't understand, Reynolds. You have this whole crowd, but I've lost everything." He turned his back and walked out of the room, leaving a heavy silence behind. Marcus took a deep breath, his voice dropping, filled with emotion. "I'm not happy to see anyone lose everything, but I'm glad Tampa doesn't have to put up with people like him anymore. We're not here to criticize. We're here to build." I told the young officers at the precinct last week, justice is treating people with respect, not prejudice. Today, I'm telling you, we're doing that and we won't stop. The crowd stood up, the applause roaring like thunder, dispelling the darkness left by Sullivan. Henry Brooks stepped forward, embracing Marcus tightly, his voice choked with emotion. "You are our soldier, Hawk. Don't let guys like him shake you." Marcus patted Henry on the shoulder, smiling. "I'm not wavering. Henry, we're stronger than that." Sarah Mitchell stepped forward, her eyes filled with pride. "Colonel, you just turned a challenge into motivation. This is why Tampa is thriving, and now the whole country is looking at us." Marcus nodded, his gaze directed out the window where sunlight streamed in. "We're not just changing Tampa. We're changing the way people see justice. Atlanta, Charlotte, New Orleans, those are just the beginning. I want you all to keep going for Maria's son, for Sarah Johnson's generation, for all of us." As the crowd slowly dispersed, Marcus stepped outside, standing under the soft sunlight. He felt the fire he had ignited spreading far beyond the borders of Tampa, reaching places he had never imagined. He whispered to himself, "This is the true power, not mine alone, but all of ours." Under the Tampa sun, Marcus knew his journey wasn't over yet, but with every step he took, he was bringing justice closer. As night fell over Tampa, Florida, a dark veil draped over Curtis Hickson Park, punctuated by the glow of the moon and the lights from Tampa Bay. Half a mile away, Colonel Marcus Hawk Reynolds stood alone on the grass, hands tucked in his pockets, his gaze fixed on the shimmering Hillsborough River. 6 months after he escaped from the 8-foot by 10-foot cell at the Tampa police station, this city had become not just a battleground for justice, but a spark that ignited flames in Atlanta, Charlotte, New Orleans, and beyond. The night breeze gently swept through, carrying the scent of salt from the sea, and Marcus felt a rare sense of peace after months of relentless struggle. He thinks about the journey since the wrongful arrest in Channelside, the chance of over 200 residents, the support from Henry Brooks, Diane Miller, Jamal Carter, Maria Lopez, and even those in the police department like Sarah Mitchell and Brian Carter. He recalls Sullivan's words at the community center, the hatred of someone who refuses to accept change. But above all, he remembers the gaze of Sarah Johnson. The young officer wanted to do the right thing, and the smile of Maria's son when he said he wanted to be like him. That's why he never gives up. Marcus pulled out his phone and checked a message from Agent David Torres. "Colonel, Atlanta reports a 15% drop in complaints after 3 months. The FBI wants you in Chicago next month. Keep the fire burning." He smiled, put his phone away, and whispered to himself, "We're going to go even further." He turned back to look at Tampa, a city that had changed him, and he had changed it. From a case of injustice, Tampa is now a model for the entire country. Complaints down by 25%, officers retrained, the community and police working closely together. But Marcus knew this wasn't the end. It was just the beginning. He raised his hand in a military salute toward the bay, a promise to those who stood up for him. "I won't stop for you." Under the moonlight, Marcus walked, each step as steady as when he led troops in Baghdad. He felt the dawn of justice approaching, not just for Tampa, but for everywhere he could reach. The fire he had ignited had spread far and wide. It would burn on, carrying a profound message. Justice is not a dream, but something we build together. The park returned to silence, with only the sound of waves lapping at Tampa Bay. But in that quiet, Marcus knew he left behind a legacy of hope, unity, and change. Thank you for joining us on the journey of Marcus Hawk Reynolds. From a wrongfully accused man in Tampa to a beacon of justice for the entire nation. The legendary Narratives channel is truly grateful for every view, every heart, and every person who has subscribed to help spread this story. From a unity of Henry, Diane, and Jamal to the resilience of Sarah and Carter, Tampa has shown that justice is not just a dream, but a power we build together. You are the motivation for us to tell inspiring stories like this. So please give us a thumbs up, hit that subscribe button, and share to keep that flame burning bright. Hello to you, warriors of hope. We'll see you in the next video. Stay tough, stay proud, and see you soon.